In the final centuries of its dominion, the Roman administration of Gaul, organized into the dioceses of Viennenses and Galliarum, began to experience a profound transformation. The robust imperial system, which had for generations maintained peace and prosperity through a network of roads, cities, and a common legal framework, found itself under immense strain. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Rhine frontier ceased to be a clearly defined border and became a porous zone of frequent conflict and migration. Constant pressure from Germanic confederations, coupled with a series of internal civil wars and imperial usurpations, drew Roman legions away from their garrisons, leaving the defense of the provinces increasingly compromised. This military vacuum did not result in an immediate collapse, but rather a gradual devolution of authority. Centralized power from Rome or Trier became intermittent, forcing local Gallo-Roman aristocrats and civic leaders to manage their own defense and administration. The great agricultural estates, or villas, which formed the backbone of the economy, became more insular and fortified, evolving into self-sufficient units that prefigured the manners of the medieval era. To address the manpower shortages and defend against more hostile groups, Roman policy increasingly relied upon the integration of Germanic peoples as foederati. These were allied tribes, settled by treaty within the empire's borders, who were granted land and subsidies in exchange for providing military service under their own chieftains. Salian Franks were settled in Toxandria, Visigoths in Aquitaine, and Burgundians in the Rhone Valley. This system fundamentally altered the demographic and military character of Gaul. The Roman army itself became heavily barbarized, with generals of Germanic origin, such as Stilicho and Aetius, rising to the supreme rank of Magister Militum and becoming the true arbiters of power in the Western Empire. These arrangements were not a controlled assimilation, but a pragmatic and often unstable solution to an ongoing crisis. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The foederati maintained their distinct cultural identities, legal customs, and military structures, creating a complex patchwork of semi-autonomous territories within the nominal framework of the Roman state. The landscape inherited by the nascent Frankish kingdom was therefore one of institutional continuity, mixed with political fragmentation. Roman law, though simplified, continued to provide the basis for legal transactions and property rights among the Gallo-Roman population. The vast network of Roman roads, though often in disrepair, still facilitated communication and trade. Vulgar Latin remained the lingua franca, forming the substrate from which the French language would evolve. Most significantly, the Christian Church had become a dominant force in civic life. As imperial administrators vanished, bishops like Germanus of Auxerre or Sidonius Apollinaris of Clermont often stepped into the void, organizing city defenses, distributing food, and acting as diplomats between the Gallo-Roman populace and the new Germanic rulers. This fusion of a persistent Roman administrative and cultural infrastructure with the military and political power of the Germanic foederati created the unique conditions from which the medieval kingdom of France would ultimately emerge. Emerging from the fragmented political landscape of northern Gaul, Clovis inherited the leadership of a Salian Frankish group around 481 CE, becoming one of several competing chieftains. His reign was defined by a ruthless and methodical consolidation of power. Through a combination of political cunning, assassination, and military conquest, he systematically eliminated his rivals, including other Frankish kings like Ragnacar of Cambrai and Chararic. By neutralizing these competing rulers, Clovis unified the disparate Salian tribes under a single authority, transforming them from a loose confederation into the core of a dynamic and expansionist kingdom. His first major military objective was the Rump State ruled by Syagrius, the last Gallo-Roman magistrate in northern Gaul. At the Battle of Soissons in 486, Frankish forces decisively defeated Syagrius's army, extinguishing the final vestige of independent Roman authority and incorporating a vital heavily Romanized territory between the Somme and the Loire into the nascent kingdom. Subsequent campaigns were directed eastward against the Alemanni, who posed a persistent threat along the Rhine. The pivotal Battle of Tolbiac, traditionally dated to 496, resulted in a crushing victory that subjugated the Alemanni and secured the northeastern frontier of his growing realm. The victory at Tolbiac is inextricably linked with the most strategically significant event of Clovis's reign, his conversion to Nicene Christianity. While other Germanic rulers, such as the Visigoths and Burgundians, had adopted Arianism, Clovis made the calculated decision to embrace the Catholic faith of his Gallo-Roman subjects. According to the chronicler Gregory of Tours, the king vowed to convert during the heat of the battle, promising his allegiance to the god of his wife, the Burgundian princess Clotilde, in exchange for victory. His subsequent baptism by Bishop Remigius of Reims was a masterstroke of statecraft. This act immediately secured the allegiance of the powerful and educated Gallo-Roman episcopate and the landowning aristocracy, who saw him as a legitimate, co-religionist ruler rather than a heretical barbarian conqueror. This support was instrumental in administering his expanding territories, as the church provided a ready-made administrative structure and a pool of literate officials. The conversion provided a powerful ideological justification for his continued military expansion, reframing his campaigns as wars of liberation for fellow Catholics under Arian rule. With his legitimacy secured and his northern and eastern flanks protected, Clovis turned his attention south toward the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse. In 507, at the Battle of Vouillé, his Frankish army confronted and defeated the forces of the Visigothic king Alaric II, who was slain in the conflict. This singular victory added the vast and wealthy province of Aquitaine to his domains, extending Frankish control to the Pyrenees and expelling Visigothic power into the Iberian Peninsula. In his final years, Clovis established Paris as his capital, a strategic choice that placed his administrative center at the nexus of key riverine trade routes. He also initiated the codification of Salic law, which blended Germanic custom with Roman legal concepts, providing a unified legal framework for his subjects. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis had not merely conquered territory. He had forged the political, religious, and legal foundations of the Merovingian dynasty and the kingdom that would be known as Francia. Upon Clovis's death in 511, the unified kingdom he had forged was immediately subjected to the Germanic custom of partible inheritance. Unlike the Roman concept of an indivisible state, the Franks viewed the realm as the personal property of the monarch, to be divided equally among his male heirs. Consequently, Francia was split between Clovis's four sons: Theuderic I, Clodomir, Childebert I, and Clothar I. Each son received a portion of the kingdom, including a share of the original Salian territory and the newly conquered lands, establishing their respective capitals at Reims, Orléans, Paris, and Soissons. This initial division set a precedent that would define the next 2 centuries of Merovingian rule, ensuring that periods of unity were brief interludes in a near-constant state of civil war. The internal logic of this system fostered endemic conflict, as each brother viewed the others not as allies, but as rivals for a larger share of the patrimony. Joint military ventures, such as the conquest of the Burgundian kingdom in the 530s, were often followed by internecine struggles over the spoils. Over several generations of division and reconsolidation, these fragmented territories coalesced into 3 distinct and consistently antagonistic sub-kingdoms. Neustria, encompassing the Romanized heartland between the Loire and the Scheldt, including Paris, retained a stronger Gallo-Roman administrative character. Austrasia, centered on the Rhine and Meuse rivers with its capital often at Metz or Reims, was more fundamentally Germanic in its culture and military aristocracy. The third major entity was Burgundy, which maintained a separate identity even after its incorporation into the Frankish domains. The political history of the 6th and 7th centuries is largely the record of the brutal wars fought between the kings of these realms. This was not institutional warfare, but a series of intensely personal, dynastic vendettas fueled by assassinations and betrayals. The most notorious of these conflicts was the decades-long feud between Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia and Queen Fredegund of Neustria, whose rivalry led to the murders of kings, bishops, and countless aristocrats, destabilizing Francia for nearly 40 years. This perpetual infighting had profound consequences for the structure of the Merovingian state. Kings were compelled to grant vast tracts of land and political immunities to their leading aristocrats, or leudes, in order to secure their loyalty and military support for civil wars. This process progressively alienated royal lands and revenues, catastrophically weakening the economic foundation of the monarchy. The aristocracy in turn grew immensely powerful, holding vast regional territories and commanding private armies. They became the true arbiters of power, able to shift their allegiance between rival Merovingian claimants to advance their own interests. Brief periods of reunification, such as under Clothar II and his son Dagobert I in the early 7th century, temporarily restored the kingdom's integrity. However, the principle of partible inheritance remained intact, and upon Dagobert's death, the realm was divided once more. This systemic erosion of royal authority and the corresponding rise of a powerful landholding nobility created a power vacuum at the heart of the kingdom, setting the stage for the emergence of a new political office that would ultimately supplant the dynasty itself. The systemic erosion of Merovingian power, accelerated by generations of civil war and the alienation of royal estates, culminated in the phenomenon of the roi fainéants, or do-nothing kings. By the mid-7th century, the monarchs had become largely symbolic figures, possessing the prestige of their lineage, but wielding little actual political or military authority. Their functions were reduced to ceremonial duties, such as presiding over the annual Marchfield assemblies where the Frankish host gathered. Real power had devolved from the king to the chief officer of his household, the mayor of the palace, or mayor domus. Initially responsible for managing the royal household and administering the king's properties, this office grew to command the palace guard, control access to the monarch, and oversee the royal treasury. As kings became younger and more ineffectual, the mayor of the palace became the de facto regent and commander-in-chief, governing the kingdom in the king's name. This transfer of power was most pronounced in the Germanic sub-kingdom of Austrasia, where the aristocracy was particularly strong. It was here that the Pippinid dynasty, also known as the Arnulfings, began its ascent. The family's power was founded on the alliance of two influential Austrasian nobles in the early 7th century, Pippin of Landen, who served as mayor of the palace, and Bishop Arnulf of Metz, a key ecclesiastical and political figure. By joining their families through marriage, they established a formidable power base that controlled both the principal secular office and a major bishopric in the kingdom. This fusion of secular and religious influence allowed them to build a vast network of patronage, securing the loyalty of other aristocratic families through grants of land and offices. The Pippinids methodically worked to make the mayoralty a hereditary position, transforming it from a royal appointment into their family's patrimony. The decisive moment in the consolidation of Pippinid power came under Pippin of Herstal. After establishing his dominance as the hereditary mayor in Austrasia, he challenged the authority of the Neustrian king and his mayor. The conflict culminated in 687 at the Battle of Tertry, where Pippin's Austrasian forces decisively defeated the Neustrian army. This victory was a pivotal event. It did not depose the Merovingian king, but it effectively eliminated the political independence of Neustria and Burgundy. Pippin of Herstal became the mayor of the palace for all of Francia, uniting the three kingdoms under a single administrative authority for the first time in decades. The Merovingian monarch was now a mere puppet, a legitimizing figurehead retained for the sake of tradition. The Pippinid mayors were the undisputed rulers of Francia in all but name, commanding the armies, dispensing justice, and controlling the state's resources. This new political reality laid the groundwork for their eventual assumption of the royal title itself. Following the death of Pippin of Herstal in 714, his illegitimate son Charles fought his way out of imprisonment to secure his inheritance as mayor of the palace, through a series of ruthless civil wars. While he consolidated his rule over a reunified Francia, a formidable external threat was advancing from the south. The Umayyad Caliphate, having conquered the Visigothic kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula after 711, began launching increasingly ambitious raids across the Pyrenees. These were not mere border skirmishes, but large-scale expeditions that overwhelmed local defences. By the early 730s, the governor of Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, led a major force into the independent Duchy of Aquitaine. He sacked the wealthy city of Bordeaux, defeated the army of Duke Odo the Great at the Battle of the River Garonne, and continued his advance north toward the rich ecclesiastical centre of Tours and its famed Abbey of St. Martin. Having been soundly defeated and facing the dissolution of his duchy, Odo, a longtime rival of Charles, was forced to seek aid from the Frankish mayor. Charles Martel, recognizing the gravity of the threat to the Frankish realm, mobilized the Austrasian host. He understood that facing the formidable Umayyad cavalry, which had proven superior to the Visigothic and Aquitanian forces, required careful strategic planning. Intercepting the advancing army somewhere between Poitiers and Tours in October 732, Charles chose his battlefield with precision, selecting an elevated, wooded position that would disrupt cavalry charges and protect his flanks. His Frankish army was composed almost entirely of veteran-heavy infantry, disciplined soldiers accustomed to fighting in tight-knit formations. In contrast, the Umayyad army consisted primarily of light and heavy cavalry, a mobile and devastating force on open terrain. For several days, the two armies faced each other, with Abd al-Rahman hesitating to attack the well-defended Frankish position. The core of the Frankish army formed a large, dense phalanx or infantry square, a wall of shields and spears that contemporary chronicles described as an immovable wall of ice. When the attack finally came, the Umayyad cavalry launched repeated, ferocious charges against the Frankish line, but they were unable to break the disciplined infantry formation. The Franks held their ground, absorbing the shock of the attacks and inflicting heavy casualties with their long spears. The battle raged for a full day, a grueling test of endurance and discipline. The turning point came when rumours, possibly started by a Frankish flanking manoeuvre led by Odo, spread through the Umayyad ranks that their camp, filled with the plunder from Bordeaux, was being threatened. A significant portion of the Umayyad cavalry broke off from the main assault to protect their loot, causing chaos and confusion. Abd al-Rahman was killed while attempting to rally his disintegrating forces. That night, the Umayyad army retreated south, abandoning their camp. The victory was decisive. It permanently halted the large-scale northward expansion of Islamic rule from Iberia and earned Charles his cognomen, Martel, the Hammer. More importantly, it vastly enhanced his personal prestige and the authority of the Pipinid family, solidifying his status as the saviour of Christendom and the undisputed master of Francia. Charles Martel's death in 741 did not disrupt the Pipinid family's hold on Francia. His authority was seamlessly transferred to his sons, Carloman and Pepin the Short, who continued to govern as mayors of the palace. They even briefly elevated a final Merovingian, Childeric III, to the throne as a legitimizing figurehead. However, the political landscape was changing rapidly, not just within Francia but south of the Alps. The papacy in Rome found itself in an increasingly vulnerable position, militarily threatened by the aggressive expansion of the Lombard kingdom in northern Italy. Its traditional protector, the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, was embroiled in the iconoclastic controversy and was geographically and politically incapable of offering effective aid. This forced the Pope to look for a new, powerful and orthodox military champion north of the Alps. The Franks, as the preeminent Catholic power in the West, were the logical choice. This convergence of interests came to a head after 747, when Carloman abdicated his power to retire to a monastery, leaving Pepin as the sole de facto ruler of the Franks. Possessing the full power of the kingdom but lacking the royal title, Pepin sought to rectify this discrepancy and secure his family's rule on a permanent, legitimate basis. In 751, he dispatched an embassy to Rome to pose a carefully worded, yet revolutionary, question to Pope Zachary. Was it right for a king to rule who held no real power? The Pope's response was a pragmatic and momentous one. He declared that it was better for the person who held the actual power to also hold the title of king, so that order might be preserved. This declaration was a profound shift, providing the ultimate spiritual sanction to transfer royal legitimacy from the centuries-old Merovingian bloodline to the effective authority of the Pippinid mayor. Acting on this papal decree, Pepin convened an assembly of Frankish nobles and clergy at Soissons later in 751. Childeric III was formally deposed, and in a potent symbolic act, his long hair, the sacred mark of Merovingian royalty, was cut off, neutralizing his dynastic power before he was sent into monastic seclusion. Pepin the Short was then elected king by the acclaim of his nobles. Crucially, he was also anointed with holy oil by Saint Boniface, the Anglo-Saxon missionary who led the church in Francia. This ceremony of unction, drawing on the precedent of Old Testament kings, fundamentally altered the nature of Frankish kingship. It was no longer based solely on lineage and military success, but was now a sacred office, a ministerium bestowed by God through the agency of the Church. The alliance was cemented in 754 when Pope Stephen II travelled to Francia, the first pope ever to do so, and personally re-anointed Pepin and his two sons, Charles and Carloman, securing the Carolingian dynastic succession. In return, Pepin fulfilled his promise of military aid, invading Italy and creating the Papal States, a territorial gift that would bind the destiny of the Carolingian dynasty and the papacy for centuries. Upon Pepin's death in 768, the Frankish kingdom was divided between his sons, Charles and Carloman. But Carloman's own death in 771 left Charles as the sole, undisputed ruler. What followed was a reign of near-constant expansionist warfare that would more than double the size of the Frankish realm. Charles, who would become known as Charlemagne or Charles the Great, was a relentless and methodical military strategist. He finalized his father's work in Italy by conquering the Lombard kingdom and declaring himself its king, permanently securing the Papal States. His longest and most brutal conflict was the 30-year Saxon Wars, a campaign of subjugation and forced conversion against the pagan Saxons in northern Germany, marked by mass deportations and harsh legislation like the Capitulary of Saxony. To the southeast, he destroyed the Avar Khaganate in modern-day Hungary, seizing an immense treasure that funded much of his imperial program. In the southwest, his campaigns against the Umayyads in Spain, though marked by setbacks like the ambush at Roncesvalles Pass, established the Spanish March, a fortified buffer zone in the Pyrenees. Through these conquests, Charlemagne forged a vast European empire, a political entity not seen in the West since the fall of Rome. His authority required new methods of governance to manage its diverse peoples. He institutionalized the use of missi dominici, pairs of secular and ecclesiastical envoys dispatched from his court to inspect local administration, enforce royal edicts known as capitularies, and report back on corruption or dissent. This system was designed to project central authority into the far reaches of the empire and ensure the loyalty of the powerful regional counts and bishops who administered the realm on his behalf. This administrative framework was complemented by a conscious revival of learning and culture. Charlemagne gathered the leading scholars of Europe, such as the Anglo-Saxon Alcuin of York, at his court in Aachen, establishing a palace school to educate a new generation of literate administrators and clergy. This intellectual revival, often called the Carolingian Renaissance, led to the standardization of liturgical texts and, most enduringly, the development of Carolingian minuscule, a clear and legible script that became the basis for modern European typography. The culmination of his reign occurred on Christmas Day, 800, in Rome. Pope Leo III, having been physically attacked by his aristocratic rivals in the city, had fled to Charlemagne for protection. After the Frankish king escorted him back to Rome and presided over an assembly that cleared the Pope of all wrongdoing, Leo performed an act of profound historical significance. During Christmas Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, as Charlemagne knelt in prayer, the Pope placed an imperial crown on his head, and the assembled congregation acclaimed him as Emperor of the Romans. This coronation revived the concept of a Western Roman Empire, creating a new universal Christian polity that formally synthesized Germanic military kingship with the administrative and legal traditions of Rome and the spiritual authority of the Catholic Church. Charlemagne was no longer just a king of the Franks. He was the divinely sanctioned protector of Western Christendom, his empire a terrestrial reflection of the city of God. The vast expansion of the Carolingian Empire created an urgent need for a trained and literate class of administrators and clergy capable of managing a diverse multilingual realm. This practical necessity, combined with Charlemagne's personal piety and respect for classical learning, fueled a deliberate and state-sponsored intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. This was not a spontaneous flourishing, but a centralized program of educational and ecclesiastical reform aimed at standardization and correction. The ultimate goal was the creation of a unified Christian empire, both in faith and in governance. At the heart of this program was the Palace School at Aachen, where Charlemagne gathered the foremost intellects of the age. The most influential of these was Alcuin of York, an Anglo-Saxon scholar whom Charlemagne recruited in 781. Alcuin became the chief architect of the educational reforms, establishing a curriculum based on the 7 liberal arts and writing textbooks on grammar and rhetoric. His most significant work was the revision and correction of the Latin Vulgate Bible, seeking to create a single, authoritative text for use across the empire to eliminate scribal errors and regional variations that had corrupted scripture over centuries. The revival's engine rooms were the great monastic and cathedral scriptoria. Imperial decrees mandated the establishment of schools at every monastery and bishopric, tasked with teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and song. Abbeys such as Fulda, Corby, and Street. Gaul became major centres for the preservation and reproduction of texts. It was in these scriptoria that the most enduring innovation of the era was perfected. Carolingian minuscule. This new script was a radical departure from the inconsistent and often illegible Merovingian and national hands. It introduced a clear distinction between upper and lower case letters, standardized punctuation, and, crucially, consistent spacing between words, making texts vastly easier to read and copy accurately. This script was a revolution in information technology, allowing for the faster and more reliable transmission of knowledge from religious texts and legal capitularies to the works of classical Roman authors like Virgil and Cicero. It is estimated that over 90% of surviving Roman works owe their existence to copies made by Carolingian scribes. This intellectual renewal was mirrored in art and architecture by a conscious emulation of Roman precedent, a concept known as Renovatio Imperii Romani. Charlemagne's Palatine Chapel in Aachen, the centerpiece of his imperial capital, was directly inspired by the Byzantine Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, using its octagonal plan and even incorporating columns and marbles brought from Rome and Ravenna. This architectural choice was a powerful political statement, visually linking his new empire to the legacy of both Constantine and Justinian. Manuscript illumination also reached new heights, blending the abstract decorative traditions of insular art with the classicism of Mediterranean models to create a new, vibrant imperial style. The Carolingian Renaissance was therefore a foundational movement that rescued classical antiquity from the brink of oblivion, forged a common European intellectual culture, and created the tools in its script and its schools that would shape the continent's development for the next millennium. The immense Carolingian Empire, forged by Charlemagne's military might, was held together by his personal authority, but its institutional foundations were too shallow to survive the powerful Frankish custom of partible inheritance. Upon Charlemagne's death in 814, the empire passed intact to his sole surviving son, Louis the Pious. A devout but less politically adept ruler, Louis struggled throughout his reign to reconcile the tradition of dividing the realm among his heirs with the Roman-inspired ideal of a single, indivisible Christian empire. His initial attempt to solve this problem, the Ordinatio Imperii of 817, designated his eldest son, Lothair, as co-emperor and primary heir, while granting the younger sons, Pepin of Aquitaine and Louis the German, subordinate kingships. This delicate balance was shattered by the birth of a fourth son, Charles the Bald, from Louis's second marriage, which prompted the emperor to redivide the territory to accommodate his youngest child. This action ignited a series of debilitating civil wars, as the elder sons rebelled against their father and each other, in a struggle for land and power that consumed the final decades of Louis's reign. When Louis the Pious died in 840, the simmering conflict erupted into open warfare. Lothair, asserting his right as emperor, claimed suzerainty over the entire realm, a claim that his brothers Louis the German and Charles the Bald immediately rejected. The two younger brothers formed a powerful alliance to resist Lothair's imperial ambitions. The decisive confrontation occurred at the Battle of Fontenoy in June 841, a fratricidal clash of catastrophic proportions. The battle resulted in a victory for the allied brothers, but at an immense cost. The Frankish aristocracy on all sides was so decimated that the conflict was seen as a divine judgment against their disunity, making a negotiated peace essential for the survival of the dynasty. The alliance was publicly solidified in 842 with the Oaths of Strasbourg, a pivotal moment where Charles and Louis swore mutual allegiance in the vernacular languages of their respective armies. Charles in the Romance tongue, an early form of French, and Louis in the Teutonic, an early form of German, highlighting the deep cultural and linguistic fissures that had already formed within the empire. This military and political reality forced the three surviving brothers to the negotiating table, culminating in the Treaty of Verdun in August 843. The empire was formally partitioned into three distinct kingdoms. Charles the Bald received the territories of West Francia, a realm largely defined by the Scheldt, Meuse, Saône, and Rhône rivers, which would form the core of the future Kingdom of France. Louis the German was granted East Francia, the predominantly Germanic-speaking lands east of the Rhine, the precursor to Germany. Lothair, while retaining the prestigious but now largely hollow title of emperor, was given Middle Francia, a long, geographically and ethnically diverse, and ultimately indefensible corridor of territory stretching from the North Sea through the Rhineland, Burgundy, Provence, and down into the Kingdom of Italy. The Treaty of Verdun was a pragmatic but momentous act. It irrevocably fractured Charlemagne's universal Christian empire and laid the permanent political and cultural foundations from which the modern nations of France and Germany would eventually emerge. The political fragmentation established at Verdun left West Francia critically vulnerable to a new and terrifying external threat. From the late 8th century, Scandinavian seafaring raiders, known to the Franks as Northmen or Vikings, began to exploit the kingdom's internal divisions. Their technological masterpiece, the shallow draft longship, allowed them to bypass coastal defences and penetrate deep into the Frankish heartland via its extensive river systems. The Seine, Loire, and Garonne became highways for devastation. Initially, these were swift hit-and-run attacks targeting wealthy, undefended monasteries like Noirmoutier and Saint-Philibert for their precious metalwork, and captured monks who could be sold as slaves. The Carolingian response was largely ineffective, characterized by slow mobilization of armies that could never match the raiders' speed. This led to the adoption of a ruinously expensive and ultimately unsustainable policy of paying tribute, or Danegeld, to bribe the Vikings into leaving, a strategy that only encouraged larger and more frequent expeditions. The nature of the threat escalated from seasonal raiding to large-scale invasion throughout the 9th century. Viking warbands began to overwinter in fortified camps established at river mouths, allowing them to launch campaigns year-round. This culminated in the Great Siege of Paris in 885-886, a monumental undertaking where a vast fleet, reputedly of hundreds of ships, blockaded the city for over a year. The defense of Paris, heroically led by Count Odo, became legendary, but the reigning Carolingian monarch, Charles the Fat, ultimately failed his subjects. Instead of fighting to relieve the city, he arrived with an army only to pay the besiegers a massive bribe and grant them permission to raid further upriver in Burgundy. This act shattered the last vestiges of Carolingian prestige and demonstrated that royal authority could no longer provide basic security. Decades of incessant warfare eventually led to a strategic shift on both sides. The Vikings began to seek land for permanent settlement, while the Frankish monarchy recognized the futility of trying to expel them. This led to the landmark Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 between the West Frankish king, Charles the Simple, and a powerful Viking leader named Rollo. In a pragmatic act of statecraft, Charles granted Rollo and his followers the territory around the lower Seine estuary. In exchange, Rollo swore fealty to the king, was baptized into the Christian faith, and, most importantly, pledged to defend the river mouth against any new Viking incursions. This treaty effectively transformed the poachers into gamekeepers. It halted the most destructive phase of the raids and created the powerful and semi-autonomous Duchy of Normandy. The Northmen, now Normans, rapidly adopted the Romance language and Frankish political customs, but their military dynamism would continue to profoundly shape the future of the kingdom they had once terrorized. The 10th century in West Francia was defined by the terminal decline of the Carolingian dynasty, a process not of sudden collapse, but of slow, inexorable erosion of royal authority. The monarchy had become a political football tossed between the last enfeebled descendants of Charlemagne and the powerful Robertian family, ancestors of Hugh Capet. This aristocratic house, which had produced heroes like Count Odo, defender of Paris, had already held the throne intermittently, creating a precedent for an elective, rather than strictly hereditary, monarchy. The king's power had become largely theoretical. Real authority resided with the great territorial magnates, the dukes of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Burgundy, and the counts of Flanders and Anjou. These princes governed their domains as virtually independent states, minting their own coinage, waging their own wars, and dispensing their own justice. The royal domain, the land under the king's direct control, had shrunk to a modest territory centered on the Ile de France, leaving the monarch weaker than several of his most powerful vassals. The final act of this long decline began with the death of the last undisputed Carolingian king, Louis V, in 987. He died young, and crucially, without a legitimate heir. This created a succession crisis that forced the magnates of the realm to make a definitive choice. The legitimate Carolingian claimant was Charles, Duke of Lower Lorraine, Louis's uncle. However, Charles was a deeply unpopular figure among the West Frankish nobility. He had become a vassal of the German emperor, Otto II, a political sin that was skillfully exploited by his rivals, who painted him as a foreign agent unfit to rule. The alternative candidate was Hugh Capet, Duke of the Franks, and the most powerful lord in the kingdom, whose Robertian lineage already possessed a quasi-royal status. The decisive moment came at an assembly of the magnates convened at Senlis. The outcome was orchestrated by Adalbero, the influential Archbishop of Reims. In a masterful speech, Adalbero argued against the principle of blind hereditary succession, proclaiming that the throne was not a right of birth, but should be conferred upon the most worthy candidate, the one best equipped to provide justice and security for the realm. He systematically dismantled Charles of Lorraine's claim, emphasizing his questionable loyalties and lack of support among the nobles. He then championed Hugh Capet as the ideal choice, a man of proven ability and immense power. Persuaded by this political maneuvering, the assembly formally elected Hugh as king. He was crowned at Noyon on July 3, 987, inaugurating a new royal house. To secure his legacy, Hugh took the crucial step of having his son Robert crowned as co-king within his first year, a practice his successors would continue for 2 centuries to methodically transform the elective monarchy back into a de facto hereditary one. The Capetian dynasty was established not by conquest, but by political consensus, beginning its long, patient task of converting nominal kingship into genuine royal power. The dynasty Hugh Capet, founded in 987, was royal in name only. In practice, its authority was profoundly circumscribed. The very reason for Hugh's election was his perceived weakness, as the great magnates who chose him sought a monarch who would not interfere with their own regional autonomy. For the next century and a half, the Capetian kings were geographically and militarily confined to their personal territory, the royal domain known as the Ile-de-France. This was not a cohesive block of land, but a patchwork of estates, forests, and towns scattered between the crucial cities of Paris and Orléans, surrounded and often encroached upon by the vast principalities of their nominal vassals. The domains of the Duke of Normandy or the Duke of Aquitaine were not only larger and more populous, but also possessed superior military resources and more sophisticated administrative structures than those of the king they had sworn to serve. The early Capetians' primary struggle was not against these great princes, whom they lacked the power to challenge directly, but against the castellans and minor lords within their own small domain. The proliferation of private castles, mottes and baileys, and later stone keeps had created a landscape dominated by local strongmen who often defied royal authority with impunity. These robber barons, such as the notorious Thomas of Malle, controlled key roads and river crossings, extorting tolls from merchants and terrorizing the local peasantry. The reigns of Hugh's successors, Robert II, Henry I, and Philip I, were largely consumed by an endless series of petty, localized wars aimed at subduing these castellans and establishing a basic monopoly on violence within the Ile-de-France. The king's army was often a small feudal host, and victory in these campaigns was a slow castle-by-castle process of siege and negotiation. Lacking significant military or economic power, the early Capetians relied on two indispensable assets. The first was the moral and spiritual authority conferred by their coronation. The anointing with holy oil at Rheims, a tradition tracing back to Clovis, elevated the king to a sacral status, setting him apart from all other secular lords. He was the Lord's anointed, a quasi-priestly figure responsible for the peace and justice of the entire kingdom, even if he could not enforce it. This ideological advantage was immense. Their second key strategy was ensuring dynastic continuity. By having their eldest son crowned as co-king during their own lifetime, they methodically transformed the elective monarchy back into a hereditary one, avoiding the succession crises that had plagued their predecessors. This long-term, patient strategy of survival, consolidating control over their own backyard, and preserving the sacred ideal of kingship, allowed the Capetian dynasty to endure its period of profound weakness, slowly laying the groundwork for the future expansion of royal power. Concurrent with the early Capetians' struggle for survival, a profound restructuring of society was solidifying across West Francia, a phenomenon many historians term the feudal revolution. This was not a single event, but a gradual shift away from the public, state-based authority of the Carolingian era toward a highly fragmented and privatized system of power based on personal bonds. At its heart was the relationship between a lord and his vassal, a free man who pledged loyalty and service in a deeply symbolic ceremony. The vassal would perform homage by kneeling, placing his hands between those of his lord, and swearing an oath of fealty, often on holy relics, to become his man. In return, the lord granted the vassal a fief, or feudum, which was typically a grant of land from which the vassal could derive revenue. This grant was not an outright gift, but was conditional upon the fulfillment of specific obligations, primarily military service, known as auxilium, and the duty to provide counsel, or consilium. This network of fealty created a complex pyramid of allegiances that defined the military aristocracy, the class of those who fight. A great duke or count was a vassal to the king, while he himself was a lord to numerous lesser counts and barons, who in turn were lords to individual knights holding a single manor. This fragmentation of power created a society where a person's primary loyalty was not to a distant king or a concept of the state, but to their immediate lord. The system was the practical response to the breakdown of central authority, providing a mechanism for raising armies and administering justice on a local level. This entire military and political superstructure rested upon the labor of the vast majority of the population, the peasantry, or those who work. The economic engine of feudalism was the manor, a self-sufficient agricultural estate controlled by a lord. Most peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land they cultivated. They were not chattel slaves who could be bought and sold individually, but their freedom of movement was severely restricted, and their status was hereditary. In exchange for a small plot of land to farm for their own subsistence, serfs owed their lord extensive obligations. These included labor service, or corvée, working a set number of days on the lord's personal lands, the domains. They also paid dues in kind from their own harvest, and were subject to the lord's justice in the manorial court. Furthermore, they were compelled to use the lord's mill, oven, and winepress, paying a fee for each use in a system of monopolies known as banalités. This rigidly hierarchical structure ensured that the agricultural surplus supported the warrior class, cementing a social order that would dominate France for centuries. The decentralized nature of feudal power, while a practical solution to the absence of central authority, fostered a state of endemic, low-level warfare. The warrior aristocracy, composed of castellans and knights, waged private wars with impunity, preying upon the very agricultural base that sustained them. In response to this chronic violence, the Church, as the sole institution with universal moral authority, initiated a transformative social movement at the close of the 10th century. Lacking a powerful king to enforce order, bishops and abbots in southern and central France began to convene great open-air councils, summoning local nobles and the common people to address the crisis. The first of these movements was the Peace of God, or Pax Dei, formally proclaimed at the Council of Charroux in 989. This was not an attempt to outlaw war itself, but to immunize certain people and property from its effects. Under threat of anathema and excommunication, knights were compelled to swear oaths on sacred relics to refrain from attacking unarmed clergy, peasants, merchants, and women. The peace also extended to sacred places such as churches and cemeteries, and to the economic assets of the peasantry, including their livestock and crops. This was a radical attempt to impose limits on the warrior class, defining non-combatants and their property as outside the legitimate sphere of military action. Building on this foundation, the Church introduced a more ambitious initiative in the early 11th century, the Truce of God, or Troga Dei. Where the peace had defined who was off-limits, the truce defined when fighting was forbidden. It sought to restrict warfare to specific days of the week and seasons of the year. Initially, it prescribed violence from Saturday evening until Monday morning, in observance of the Sunday resurrection. This was soon extended to include Fridays, in honor of the crucifixion, and Thursdays for the Last Supper. The truce was further expanded to cover entire liturgical seasons, such as Lent and Advent. While enforcement was inconsistent and depended entirely on the local influence of bishops and the piety of lords, the Truce of God aimed to fundamentally alter the rhythm of warfare, making peace the norm and conflict the exception. These councils also powerfully reasserted the ancient concept of sanctuary, declaring church grounds as inviolable refuges. Together, these movements were instrumental in the ideological formation of the knightly class. By channeling the martial energies of the aristocracy, the Church began to cultivate a new ethos. The ideal knight was no longer simply a warlord, but a Christian soldier, a Miles Christi, whose sacred duty was to protect the weak, defend the Church, and uphold justice. This effort to sanctify the warrior's vocation laid the essential groundwork for the code of chivalry and provided a theological justification for directing organized violence outward, a principle that would soon find its ultimate expression in the Crusades. Parallel to the church's efforts to pacify the warrior aristocracy, an internal spiritual revolution was underway, aimed at purifying the institution of monasticism itself. For centuries, monasteries had become deeply entangled in the secular world, often treated as private property by the lords who founded them. Abbots were frequently appointed not for their piety, but for their political loyalty, leading to a widespread decline in adherence to the rule of street. Benedict, the foundational text of Western monasticism, in response to successive reform movements originating in French Burgundy, would profoundly reshape the spiritual, economic, and political landscape of the entire kingdom. The first began with the founding of the Abbey of Cluny in 910 by Duke William I of Aquitaine. Its charter was revolutionary. It freed the monastery from all local secular and episcopal control, placing it directly under the authority of the Pope in Rome. This independence allowed Cluny to elect its own abbot and enforce a strict observance of Benedictine principles. The Cluniac model was one of centralized power. Unlike traditional monasteries, which were autonomous, new foundations became priories, subordinate to the mother house. The abbot of Cluny was the absolute head of a vast federated order that eventually numbered over 1,000 houses across Europe. The Cluniac monks reprioritized the Opus Dei, or work of God, focusing on an exceptionally elaborate and continuous cycle of liturgical prayer. They saw themselves as specialists in intercession, praying for the souls of their benefactors. This spiritual service attracted enormous patronage from the aristocracy, and Cluny amassed immense wealth in land and treasures, becoming a major political and economic power. By the late 11th century, however, this very success was viewed by some as a new form of corruption. The second wave of reform began as a direct reaction to Cluniac splendor. In 1098, a group of monks led by Robert of Molesme left their comfortable abbey to found a new one at Citeaux, also in Burgundy, with the intention of pursuing a more austere and literal interpretation of the Benedictine rule. The Cistercians rejected the wealth and liturgical complexity of Cluny. They emphasized manual labor as an essential part of monastic life, under the principle of ora et labora, pray and work. Their abbeys were deliberately built in remote, uncultivated lands, forests and swamps, which they then transformed into productive agricultural estates, known as granges. To manage these farms, they developed an innovative system of lay brothers, or conversi, who took monastic vows but were dedicated to labor rather than the full liturgical cycle. Spearheaded by charismatic figures like Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian order expanded rapidly, its emphasis on simplicity, self-sufficiency, and austerity offering a powerful alternative to Cluniac grandeur and fundamentally altering both the spiritual and physical landscape of France. In the mid-11th century, the political landscape of West Francia was profoundly and permanently altered by events originating in one of its most powerful and autonomous duchies. The Duchy of Normandy, forged from the Viking settlement of Rollo, was a nominal vassal of the French crown, but in practice its duke wielded power that often rivaled or surpassed that of the early Capetian kings. This fragile equilibrium shattered in 1066, a year of dynastic crisis across the English Channel. In January, the Anglo-Saxon King of England, Edward the Confessor, died without an heir, creating a power vacuum with three principal claimants. The English Witan, or Council of Magnates, quickly elected Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in the kingdom. However, Duke William of Normandy asserted a competing claim, maintaining that Edward, his cousin, had promised him the throne, and that Harold himself had sworn an oath on holy relics to support this succession during a visit to Normandy. The third claimant, King Harald Hardrada of Norway, based his claim on a prior agreement between his predecessor and a former Danish King of England. Harold Godwinson's reign began under immediate threat. He first faced the Norwegian invasion in the north, decisively defeating and killing Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066. But just 3 days later, Duke William's invasion fleet, having been delayed by unfavourable winds, landed unopposed at Pevensey on the southern coast. This forced Harold and his exhausted housecarls into a desperate forced march of over 250 miles back to the south to confront the second invasion. The armies met on October 14th near Hastings. The forces were technologically and tactically distinct. The Anglo-Saxons, fighting on foot, formed their renowned shield wall, an interlocking defensive line of spearmen, while the Normans deployed a combined arms force of archers, infantry, and, crucially, mounted knights. After a full day of brutal fighting, in which Norman feigned retreats failed to break the English line, Harold Godwinson was killed famously, according to tradition, by an arrow to the eye. His death shattered the Anglo-Saxon command structure and led to a complete Norman victory. William marched on London and was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. This single event created an intractable political paradox that would define Franco-English relations for the next 4 centuries. William the Conqueror was now a sovereign king, the equal of his theoretical overlord, Philip I of France. Yet for his lands in Normandy he remained a duke and a vassal, legally obligated to perform homage and provide feudal service to the French crown. A king was now a vassal to another king. This unprecedented and fundamentally unstable relationship, where a vassal possessed a crown and resources outside his lord's control, laid the foundation for centuries of rivalry, intrigue, and open warfare between the Kingdom of France and its most powerful, and now royal, vassal. The internal reordering of the French spiritual and martial classes created a potent expansionary energy that found its ultimate outlet at the close of the 11th century. The catalyst was a request for military aid from the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, whose Anatolian territories were being overrun by the Seljuk Turks following the disastrous Battle of Manzikert in 1071. In 1095, Alexios's envoys appealed to Pope Urban II for Western mercenaries to help reclaim these lands. At the Council of Clermont in November of that year, Urban, a French pope and former prior of Cluny, dramatically transformed this limited military request into a call for an unprecedented mass-armed pilgrimage. Addressing a vast assembly of clergy and nobles, he preached of the suffering of Eastern Christians and the desecration of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which had been under Muslim control for centuries. He skillfully channeled the martial piety cultivated by the peace and truce of God movements, offering a new, sanctified purpose for the warrior class. The Pope offered a plenary indulgence, the remission of all temporal punishment for sin, to any who took up the cross, effectively creating a spiritual reward for military action. The response, famously summarized by the cry, Deus vult, or God wills it, was immediate and overwhelming. While contingents came from across Western Christendom, the expedition was fundamentally a French enterprise. Its leadership and the vast majority of its participants were French-speaking nobles from within the Kingdom of France and the western lands of the Holy Roman Empire. King Philip I was excommunicated and did not participate, but his brother, Hugh of Vermandois, was among the first to take the cross. The expedition was not a single, unified army, but a collection of powerful contingents, each led by a major magnate. Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, the oldest and wealthiest of the princes, led a large army from Provence. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, and his brothers, Eustace and Baldwin, commanded a force of Lotharingians. The Normans of southern Italy, under the command of Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred, formed another formidable contingent. After a long and arduous journey, marked by victories against the Seljuks at Nicaea and Dorylaeum, and a brutal, months-long siege of Antioch, the main Crusader force, severely depleted, reached Jerusalem in June 1099. On July 15th, they breached the city's defences and conducted a ruthless sack, massacring most of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. This military success did not result in the restoration of Byzantine territory, but in the creation of entirely new, independent, Western-style feudal states in the Levant. Godfrey of Bouillon was elected the first ruler of the new kingdom of Jerusalem, while other leaders established the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli, transplanting French feudal structures and a French-speaking aristocracy directly onto the political landscape of the Middle East. The dawn of the 12th century found the Capetian monarchy in a precarious state, its direct authority scarcely extending beyond the confines of the Ile-de-France. Even within this core royal domain, the king's power was more theoretical than actual, consistently challenged by a local aristocracy of Castellans who had transformed their wooden keeps into formidable stone castles. From these private fortresses, petty lords like Hugh of Le Puiset and Thomas of Marle effectively defied royal jurisdiction. They functioned as robber barons, imposing illicit tolls on merchant traffic along the vital roads and rivers connecting Paris and Orléans, plundering the lands of nearby abbeys and bishoprics, and terrorizing the peasantry. This endemic disorder not only stifled commerce, but fundamentally undermined the king's primary feudal responsibility, to be the guarantor of peace and justice. The task of reversing this century-long decline in royal prestige fell to Louis VI, who ascended to the throne in 1108. Known to history as the Fat, due to his increasing corpulence in later life, his physical appearance belied a monarch of relentless energy and unwavering purpose. Guided by his chief advisor and biographer, Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, Louis VI embarked upon a reign defined by near-constant military action. His strategy was not one of grand territorial expansion, but of methodical attritional police work within his own domain. For nearly 30 years, he moved tirelessly from one rebellious castle to another, conducting siege after siege. These were not sophisticated military operations, often relying on simple blockade and assault rather than advanced siege engines, but they were persistent. The primary objective was the destruction of castra adulterina, or unauthorized castles, which were the physical basis of the Castellans' power. His campaigns against Hugh of Le Puiset, for example, spanned 2 decades, requiring multiple sieges of the same fortress as the recalcitrant lord repeatedly rebuilt his power base. Acting frequently on the appeal of churchmen whose lands had been violated, Louis and Abbot Suger framed these campaigns as a holy duty. Thomas of Marle was denounced as a raging wolf, and the royal army, often accompanied by local church militias, was portrayed as the instrument of divine justice. The cumulative effect of these small-scale wars was transformative. By the end of his reign in 1137, Louis VI had systematically dismantled the strongholds of the most defiant barons. Key fortresses like Montlhéry, which had once choked off the road from Paris to Orléans, were now firmly in royal hands. The roads of the Ile-de-France were made safe for commerce, and the domains of the church were secured from arbitrary predation. While Louis VI had not significantly expanded the kingdom's borders, he had achieved something far more critical. He had become the undisputed master in his own heartland. This pacification of the royal domain created a secure and increasingly prosperous territorial base, providing the essential foundation of revenue and manpower from which his successors could begin to project Capetian authority over the great feudal magnates of the wider kingdom. The secure foundation established by Louis VI allowed his successor, Louis VII, to secure a marriage of unparalleled strategic importance. In 1137, he wed Eleanor, the heiress to the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, a territory that stretched across nearly a third of modern France, encompassing Gascony and Poitou. This union briefly brought an immense portion of the kingdom under the direct control of the crown, dwarfing the traditional royal domain. However, the marriage was a failure on both personal and political levels. The pious and ascetic king was a poor match for the cultured and spirited duchess. Their incompatibility was famously highlighted during the disastrous Second Crusade, an experience that strained their relationship to the breaking point. Critically, after 15 years of marriage, the union had produced only 2 daughters, failing in its primary dynastic duty of providing a male heir to the Capetian line. In March 1152, the marriage was annulled at the Council of Beaugency. The official grounds were consanguinity, the couple being fourth cousins, a convenient and common pretext for dissolving politically inconvenient unions. The immediate consequence was a geopolitical catastrophe for the Capetians. Eleanor resumed personal control of her vast inheritance, and the French crown lost all its claims to the south. Now the most powerful and sought-after single woman in Europe, Eleanor acted with astonishing speed. Just 8 weeks after the annulment, in May 1152, she married Henry Plantagenet. This match was a masterstroke. Henry was already the Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, and, through his mother Matilda, the Duke of Normandy. The marriage instantly combined Eleanor's massive southern domains with Henry's powerful northern and western holdings, creating a formidable block of territories. The situation escalated dramatically 2 years later. In 1154, following the death of King Stephen, Henry Plantagenet ascended to the English throne as King Henry II. This final act consolidated the creation of a vast composite state, later termed the Angevin Empire. From the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees, a single ruler now controlled England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Aquitaine, and Gascony. The King of France now faced a new political reality. His most powerful vassal was not only a king in his own right, but also the direct lord of more French territory than the Capetian monarch himself. This enormous and inherently unstable Angevin aggregation of lands, stitched together by inheritance and a single marriage, reset the political map of Western Europe and locked the crowns of France and England into a dynastic rivalry that would define the next 3 centuries. While the Capetian and Plantagenet crowns contended for political dominion, a revolution in stone and glass was beginning just north of Paris that would redefine the architectural landscape of Western Christendom. The catalyst was not a king, but a churchman of immense political and intellectual influence, Abbot Suger of the Royal Abbey of Saint Denis. The abbey served as the traditional necropolis for French kings and housed the relics of the nation's patron saint, making it a site of supreme ideological importance to the monarchy. By the early 12th century, however, its ancient Carolingian basilica was physically decaying and functionally obsolete, too small to accommodate the growing crowds of pilgrims. Suger, who served as regent of France during Louis VII's participation in the Second Crusade, envisioned a reconstruction that would be not merely larger, but an entirely new form of sacred space. His architectural program was rooted in a specific theological concept, heavily influenced by the Neoplatonic writings of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, a 5th century mystic mistakenly identified with Saint Denis himself. This theology equated divine light, or lux, with the very essence of God. Suger sought to create a building that would be a physical manifestation of this divine light, an architecture where heavy, solid stone could be transfigured into a luminous, seemingly weightless structure. Beginning in 1140, work commenced on the eastern end, or chevet, of the basilica. To achieve his vision, Suger's master masons synthesized and systematically applied several existing, but previously isolated, structural innovations. The first was the pointed arch, which directs the downward and outward thrust of a vault more efficiently than the traditional Romanesque rounded arch. The second, and most crucial, was the ribbed vault. By constructing a skeletal framework of stone ribs, the masons could channel the immense weight of the ceiling not onto thick, solid walls, but onto slender piers. This skeletal structure effectively freed the walls from their primary load-bearing function. The outward pressure created by these vaults was counteracted by heavy buttresses built into the exterior walls. This integrated system of pointed arches and ribbed vaults allowed the masons to eliminate the need for the massive, light-blocking walls characteristic of Romanesque architecture. The result, consecrated in 1144, was revolutionary. The new choir of Saint-Denis was a structure of unprecedented height and luminosity. The space between the structural piers was opened up, and filled with vast expanses of stained glass, flooding the interior with coloured, ethereal light that Suger described as the light divine. This new style, initially known as opus franciginum or French work, was a tangible symbol of the growing prestige and ambition of the Capetian monarchy, centred in the Île-de-France. From Saint-Denis, its principles rapidly spread to the new cathedrals being built at Sens, Noyon, and Paris, initiating the age of Gothic architecture that would dominate European construction for the next 300 years. The accession of Philip II, later known as Augustus, in 1180, marked the beginning of a calculated and relentless assault on the political structure that had left his predecessors so constrained. He inherited a kingdom overshadowed by the immense power of the Angevin Empire, ruled by the formidable Henry II of England. Where previous Capetians had struggled merely to survive, Philip employed a masterful combination of legal cunning, diplomatic intrigue, and military force to systematically dismantle his rival's continental holdings. His primary strategy was not direct confrontation, but the persistent exploitation of the single greatest weakness of the Plantagenet dynasty, its own internal dysfunction. For years, Philip actively fomented rebellion among Henry II's, providing financial support and military aid to Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John in their continuous wars against their father. By keeping the Angevin domains embroiled in civil war, he weakened his opponent from within, patiently waiting for a decisive opportunity. That opportunity arose after the death of Richard the Lionheart and the accession of his brother John in 1199. King John's reign was marked by a series of catastrophic political and personal misjudgments that Philip skillfully exploited. John's abduction of and marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, who was already betrothed to one of his key Poitevin vassals, Hugh de Lusignan, constituted a grave breach of feudal custom. When the Lusignans appealed to their overlord Philip for justice, the French king had his legal pretext. He summoned John, in his capacity as Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, to appear before the royal court in Paris. John's refusal to attend this summons, a predictable act of defiance, allowed Philip to make a revolutionary legal move. In 1202, the court declared all of John's continental fiefs to be forfeit, legally authorizing the French crown to seize them by force. What followed was a swift and stunningly successful military campaign. Between 1202 and 1204, Philip's forces conquered the entirety of Normandy, the ancestral heartland of the Plantagenet kings. The capture of the supposedly impregnable fortress of Château Gaillard in 1204 symbolized the collapse of Angevin power. Shortly thereafter, the territories of Maine, Anjou, and Touraine also fell under Capetian control. The final decisive confrontation came in 1214 at the Battle of Bouvines. John had assembled a grand European coalition against France, including the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV and the rebellious Count of Flanders. Against this formidable alliance, Philip won a crushing victory. Bouvines was one of the most significant battles of the Middle Ages. It shattered the coalition, confirmed French possession of the conquered territories, and permanently broke the Angevin Empire's hold on northern France. By the end of his reign in 1223, Philip II had quadrupled the royal domain, creating a powerful, centralized, and solvent state that was now the preeminent power in Western Europe. The loss of his northern French territories was a humiliation King John could not accept, leading him to engineer a grand European coalition designed to crush Philip Augustus and reclaim the Angevin inheritance. The strategy, finalized in 1214, was ambitious, a coordinated two-front invasion of France. John himself would lead an army from the south, attacking through Poitou to draw Philip's forces away from Paris. Meanwhile, a far larger primary invasion force would strike from the northeast. This northern army was a formidable alliance of Philip's most powerful enemies, led by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV and including the disaffected Ferdinand, Count of Flanders, and Renaud of Damartin, Count of Boulogne. Their combined objective was to converge on Paris, depose the Capetian king, and partition the kingdom among themselves. The initial phase of the plan unfolded as intended. John's southern campaign met with some success, forcing Philip to dispatch his son, Prince Louis, with a significant portion of the French army to contain the threat. This left Philip with a smaller force to confront the main invasion from the north. On July 27, 1214, the two armies met near the bridge at Bouvines in Flanders. Philip, having successfully blunted John's southern advance, had marched his army north. He was attempting to withdraw across the River Marque when the coalition army, numerically superior with an estimated 9,000 troops to Philip's 7,000, caught his rearguard and forced a battle. Philip had to reverse his column and deploy his forces onto the plain. The French army was composed of a corps of feudal knights, but critically, it also included large, disciplined contingents of urban militia from the royal towns, a testament to the growing alliance between the crown and the commons. The ensuing battle was not a contest of subtle tactics, but a brutal, sprawling melee that lasted for 3 hours. The engagement devolved into 3 distinct combats across the line. In the centre, Philip himself was unhorsed and nearly killed, saved only by the intervention of his household knights. The decisive action occurred on the French right wing, where the French cavalry, led by the Duke of Burgundy, managed to rout the Flemish knights under Count Ferdinand, who was captured. On the opposite flank, Renaud of Boulogne fought a desperate defensive action until he too was overwhelmed and taken prisoner. The Emperor Otto IV, seeing his standard fall and his allies captured, fled the field. The French victory was absolute. Bouvines was arguably the most important battle in early French history. It confirmed the permanent loss of the Angevin territories for the English crown and shattered the coalition. The defeat directly weakened King John's authority, precipitating the baronial revolt that led to Magna Carta the following year. For France, the victory secured the massive territorial gains of Philip's reign and established the Capetian monarchy for the first time as the undisputed hegemonic power in Western Europe. While Philip Augustus consolidated royal power in the north, the territories of the Languedoc in the south of France represented a distinct and largely autonomous civilization. This region, culturally and linguistically separate from the north, had become the center of a powerful religious movement known as Catharism. The Cathars espoused a dualist theology, believing in a good God who created the spiritual realm and an evil God, the creator of the corrupt material world. Consequently, they rejected the core tenets of the Catholic Church, including the sacraments, the priesthood, the veneration of saints, and the physical incarnation of Christ. The Cathar faith was led by an elite group of celibate ascetics known as perfecti, who were seen as living saints by a much larger body of believers, or credentes. The local nobility of the Languedoc, particularly the powerful Counts of Toulouse, tolerated and in many cases protected the Cathars, creating a society where the heresy flourished, posing a direct theological and institutional challenge to the authority of the Roman papacy. For decades, the Church attempted to counter the heresy through preaching and debate, but these efforts proved largely fruitless. The turning point came in 1208 with the assassination of the papal legate, Pierre de Castelnau, an act widely blamed on the court of Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. This provided Pope Innocent III with the justification he needed to call for a crusade, the first to be directed not against Muslims in the Levant, but against Christians within Europe. The Pope offered the lands of the heretics as a reward to any northern French lord willing to take up the cross. The Capetian monarchy was initially hesitant to commit royal forces, but the crusade was enthusiastically joined by a host of northern barons, led by the ambitious and ruthless Simon de Montfort. The ensuing campaign, which began in 1209, was characterized by exceptional brutality. At the siege of Béziers, when asked how to distinguish heretics from Catholics, the papal legate Arnaud Amaury is famously, if perhaps apocryphally, reported to have commanded, "Kill them all." God, will know his own. The subsequent massacre saw the slaughter of the city's entire population. For 2 decades, the war devastated the Languedoc. Great cities like Carcassonne fell, the local nobility was systematically dispossessed, and the unique courtly culture of the south was effectively destroyed. While the military crusade officially ended with the Treaty of Paris-Meaux in 1229, which transferred the vast holdings of the Counts of Toulouse to the French crown, the suppression of the faith continued. The Papal Inquisition was formally established in the region to systematically hunt down, interrogate, and eliminate the remaining Catholic believers, a process that culminated in the fall of their final mountain stronghold of Montségur in 1244. The Albigensian Crusade resulted not only in the eradication of a major heresy, but also in the political subjugation of southern France, firmly integrating it into the Capetian kingdom. Contemporaneous with the expansion of royal and ecclesiastical power, Paris was becoming the undisputed intellectual capital of Western Christendom, a transformation institutionalized through the rise of the University of Paris. This institution did not emerge from a single royal decree, but evolved organically from the collection of schools attached to the city's great churches, most notably the Cathedral School of Notre Dame. By the late 12th century, the sheer number of masters and students gathering on the left bank had coalesced into a self-regulating corporation, a Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, which sought to protect its members and establish academic standards. The university's formal existence was secured through a series of foundational charters. In 1200, King Philip Augustus granted the scholars legal privileges, protecting them from the jurisdiction of the city's secular provost. Even more critical were the papal bulls, such as Parens Scientiarum in 1231, which granted the university the right to govern itself, set its own curriculum, and award degrees, effectively freeing it from the direct control of the local bishop and making it a transnational entity under papal protection. The intellectual engine of the university was the method of scholasticism. This was not a single philosophy, but a systematic approach to inquiry, honed to reconcile the rediscovered works of classical philosophers, particularly Aristotle, with the doctrines of Christian theology. The scholastic method was dialectical, beginning with a question or proposition, quaestio, systematically laying out arguments and authoritative texts for and against sic non, and culminating in a synthesized resolution, sententia, that resolved the apparent contradictions. This rigorous logical framework dominated all academic discourse. The groundwork for this method was laid by figures like Peter Abelard in the early 12th century, whose controversial teaching emphasized logic as the key to understanding faith. By the 13th century, the university had reached its zenith, personified by the work of the Dominican friar Thomas Aquinas. In his masterwork, the Summa Theologica, Aquinas perfected the scholastic method to construct a comprehensive philosophical system that integrated Aristotelian reason with Christian revelation. He argued that faith and reason were complementary, not contradictory, paths to divine truth. The university was organized into 4 faculties: arts, theology, canon law, and medicine. The Faculty of Arts provided the foundational education in the 7 liberal arts, a prerequisite for advanced study. The Faculty of Theology, however, was the university's most prestigious branch, making Paris the ultimate authority on doctrinal matters for all of Europe. Its graduates, trained in the rigorous dialectic of scholasticism, went on to fill the highest offices of the Church and secular states, cementing the University of Paris as the intellectual heart of the medieval world. The reign of Louis IX, beginning in 1226, marked a profound shift in the character of the Capetian monarchy, moving from the aggressive territorial expansion of his grandfather, Philip Augustus, to a model of kingship defined by justice, piety, and moral authority. Louis's personal devotion was legendary and thoroughly documented by his contemporaries, including his biographer Jean de Joinville. He practiced extreme asceticism, wearing a hair shirt, fasting rigorously and attending multiple masses each day. More than mere ritual, his faith manifested in acts of charity. He established hospitals, cared for the indigent, and famously washed the feet of lepers. This personal piety was not separate from his role as king, but formed the very foundation of his governance, as he sought to create a terrestrial kingdom that mirrored the divine order. His goal was the moral and administrative reform of France, ensuring justice was accessible to all his subjects. To this end, Louis IX institutionalized royal justice on an unprecedented scale. He solidified the role of the Parlement of Paris, transforming it from a mere advisory council into the kingdom's supreme judicial body, a high court of appeal that began to systematically codify French law. To extend this royal justice throughout the realm and curb the endemic corruption of local officials, he created the system of enquêteurs. These royal commissioners travelled to the provinces to hear grievances directly from the populace and bring cases of administrative abuse to the king's attention. His commitment to legal reform was codified in the Great Ordinance of 1254, a sweeping set of regulations that, among other things, officially outlawed trial by ordeal and the practice of private wars between his vassals, replacing feudal violence with royal arbitration. His reign also saw Paris cemented as a capital of Christendom, not just intellectually, but spiritually. Louis's acquisition of the crown of thorns and other passion relics from the financially destitute Latin Emperor of Constantinople was a major coup. To house these sacred objects, he commissioned the Sainte-Chapelle, a masterpiece of Rayonnant Gothic architecture, designed as a colossal reliquary of stone and glass. Yet, his devotion also compelled him to pursue the crusading ideal. He led the Seventh Crusade to Egypt in 1248, which, despite the initial capture of Damietta, ended in a catastrophic defeat and Louis's own capture. Undeterred, he organized the Eighth Crusade in 1270, landing in Tunis where his army was ravaged by disease. Louis himself succumbed to dysentery, dying a crusader's death. The profound impact of his just rule and piety was so great that he was canonized by the Church in 1297, becoming Saint Louis, the embodiment of the ideal Christian monarch. The acquisition of the Passion relics by Louis IX was a theological and political triumph that required an architectural setting of commensurate significance. The result was the Sainte-Chapelle, consecrated in 1248 within the royal palace complex on the Ile de la Cité. More than just a chapel, this structure represents the technical and aesthetic culmination of the Gothic architectural phase known as Rayonnant. This style evolved from the monumental scale of high Gothic cathedrals like Chartres and Reims, shifting the focus from immense structural mass to an extreme reduction of solid surfaces. The primary objective of the Rayonnant style was the dematerialization of the stone wall, transforming it into a skeletal framework whose primary purpose was to support vast expanses of stained glass. This was achieved through a highly refined structural system that pushed Gothic engineering to its limits. The Sainte-Chapelle's design genius lies in its two-tiered structure. The lower chapel, intended for palace servants, is comparatively modest, with robust vaults and a richly painted interior that supports the floor of the main sanctuary above. The upper chapel, reserved for the king, his court, and the display of the relics, is where the Rayonnant ideal is fully realized. Here, the load-bearing walls have been almost entirely eliminated. The stone vault, soaring over 20 meters, does not rest on massive piers, but on a delicate-looking framework of slender columns and thin mullions. The structural stability is maintained by a discrete system of external buttresses and, crucially, by an innovative use of iron reinforcement. A network of iron chains or chainage encircles the upper chapel, bracing the stonework against the outward thrust of the vaults and counteracting wind pressure, a technique that allowed the builders to achieve an unprecedented ratio of glass to stone. This structural audacity served a single purpose: to accommodate the chapel's legendary stained glass windows. Comprising 15 enormous lancets and a later rose window, The glass covers over 600 square meters, creating an immersive environment of colored light. The windows contain one of the most extensive narrative programs of the medieval era, depicting 113 scenes from the Bible, from Genesis through the Passion of Christ. The final window breaks from Scripture to narrate the story of the relics themselves, their discovery, their purchase by Louis IX, and their triumphant procession into Paris. This iconographic program was a masterful work of royal propaganda, visually weaving the history of the Capetian monarchy into the fabric of Salvation history, and presenting Louis IX not merely as a king, but as the divinely chosen custodian of Christendom's most sacred objects. The Sainte-Chapelle was the ultimate architectural expression of this sacred kingship, a jewel box built to house the divine, and in doing so, to sanctify the French crown itself. The reign of Philip IV, beginning in 1285, represented a stark departure from the sanctified kingship of his grandfather, Louis IX. Where Louis had governed through moral authority and personal piety, Philip, known as the Fair for his handsome appearance, ruled with a cold pragmatism that laid the foundations of a modern, centralized state. His objective was the absolute supremacy of the crown, an end he pursued through the systematic expansion of royal administration, law, and, most critically, finance. At the heart of this transformation was the replacement of the traditional feudal court with a professionalized bureaucracy. Philip increasingly relied on a new class of civil servants, the legistes, men of non-noble birth, who had been educated in Roman law at universities like Orléans and Paris. Figures such as Guillaume de Nogaret became the king's indispensable agents, their loyalty sworn to the abstract concept of the state and the person of the king, not to the intricate web of feudal obligations. These salaried professionals built a government machinery capable of systematic and impersonal administration. This new bureaucracy became the engine for an aggressive expansion of royal justice. The Parlement of Paris, which had been formalized under Louis IX, was weaponized by Philip's lawyers. Staffed by these same legistes, it systematically worked to subordinate all other legal authorities, feudal, municipal, and ecclesiastical, to the king's law. They championed the Roman law principle that what pleases the prince has the force of law, using it to justify royal intervention in disputes previously reserved for local lords. This legal centralization was not merely an administrative exercise. It was a direct assault on the fragmented powers of the feudal aristocracy, slowly eroding their autonomy and replacing it with the uniform authority of the crown. This expanding state apparatus and Philip's incessant wars, particularly against England in Gascony and the rebellious Flemish cities, created a desperate and continuous need for revenue. Traditional feudal income was entirely insufficient. Consequently, Philip's government pioneered new and deeply unpopular forms of national taxation. He imposed levies on clerical incomes, which led directly to a titanic struggle with Pope Boniface VIII over the crown's right to tax the church. He instituted the maltote, a universal sales tax, and devalued the kingdom's currency to meet his obligations. In his most ruthless financial maneuvers, Philip targeted groups with significant assets but little political protection. He expelled the Jewish population from France in 1306, confiscating their property and loans. A year later, he launched a meticulously planned operation to arrest every member of the Knights Templar, suppressing the wealthy military order on fabricated charges of heresy in order to seize their immense treasury. Through these brutal but effective methods, Philip IV forged a new kind of monarchy, one built not on piety, but on bureaucracy, law, and a powerful, centralized treasury. Philip IV's creation of a centralized, financially demanding state inevitably set him on a collision course with the one transnational power that claimed universal authority, the papacy. The conflict ignited in 1296 when Philip, needing funds for his war against England, imposed a tax on the French clergy. In response, Pope Boniface VIII, a canon lawyer with an uncompromising view of papal supremacy, issued the bull Clericis Laicos, which strictly forbade secular rulers from taxing the clergy without prior papal approval. Philip's countermove was swift and devastatingly effective. He placed an embargo on the export of all precious metals and currency from France, a measure that cut off the flow of French ecclesiastical revenues to Rome. Faced with this fiscal strangulation, Boniface was forced into a humiliating retreat, issuing a new bull that effectively conceded the king's right to tax the clergy in emergencies. The truce was short-lived. In 1301, the conflict reignited when Philip arrested the Bishop of Pamiers, Bernard Cessé, on charges of treason. This act was a direct violation of the canonical principle of clerical immunity, which held that clergymen could only be tried in church courts. Boniface's reaction was furious. He revoked all previous concessions and in 1302 issued the papal bull Unum Sanctum. This document was the most extreme declaration of papal theocracy in the medieval period. It unequivocally stated that there was one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, outside of which there was neither salvation nor remission of sins, and that both spiritual and temporal power resided with the Pope. The bull concluded with the audacious claim that it was absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. Faced with this ideological challenge, Philip mobilized the kingdom. In 1302, he summoned the First Estates General, a representative assembly of the clergy, nobility, and commoners, who collectively drafted a statement of support for the king against what they termed papal encroachment on French sovereignty. With the nation consolidated behind him, Philip dispatched his ruthless agent Guillaume de Nogaret to Italy. On September 7, 1303, Nogaret, allied with the Pope's Italian enemies, the Colonna family, led a force of soldiers into the papal residence at Anagni. They stormed the palace, confronted the 86-year-old Pope, and subjected him to physical assault and imprisonment. Although local townspeople freed Boniface after 2 days, the outrage of Anagni had shattered papal prestige. The Pope died a month later, his authority broken. The event was a watershed moment, demonstrating that the raw power of a centralized monarchy, with its bureaucracy and national support, could now decisively overcome the spiritual claims of the universal church. Having successfully subordinated the papacy to his will, Philip IV turned the machinery of his state against a new target, one whose immense wealth could solve the crown's perpetual financial crisis. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or Knights Templar, had for 2 centuries been one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom. Their original crusading purpose, however, had largely vanished with the fall of Acre in 1291. What remained was a formidable transnational corporation, a military order that had evolved into a sophisticated international banking system, holding vast deposits of cash, owning extensive lands throughout Europe, and acting as financiers to kings and popes. This combination of immense wealth and political obsolescence made them a uniquely vulnerable target for the indebted French king. The operation against them was a masterpiece of state-sponsored terror, executed with a secrecy and coordination previously unimaginable. In the pre-dawn hours of Friday, October 13, 1307, royal agents acting on sealed orders simultaneously arrested every Templar in France, including the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. The knights were taken completely by surprise. Once in custody, they were handed over to royal inquisitors who subjected them to systematic and brutal torture. Under duress, a significant number confessed to a litany of sensational charges that had been carefully prepared by Philip's government. These included denying Christ, spitting on the cross during secret initiation rites, worshipping an idolized head known as Baphomet, and engaging in institutionalized sodomy. The confessions, extracted through agony, provided a veneer of legal justification for Philip's actions. The king now pressured the newly elected French Pope, Clement V, who had relocated the papacy to Avignon under French influence, to sanction a church-wide investigation. Though initially hesitant, Clement buckled under royal pressure. The subsequent trials were a travesty of justice. When dozens of Templars attempted to recant their forced confessions, they were summarily condemned as relapsed heretics and burned at the stake. Finally, in 1312, at the Council of Vienne, Clement issued the papal bull Vox in excelso, formally dissolving the Templar order not through a guilty verdict, which he could not secure, but on the grounds that its reputation had been irrevocably damaged. The order's assets were officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, but Philip IV ensured the French crown received the lion's share, claiming vast sums for the expenses of the trial. The final act came in March 1314, when Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake on an island in the Seine, bringing a brutal end to an order that had been destroyed by the calculated greed of the modern state it had helped to finance. The death of Pope Boniface VIII, following the humiliation at Anagni, created a power vacuum that Philip IV was perfectly positioned to fill. After the brief pontificate of Boniface's successor, the conclave in 1305 elected a Frenchman, Bertrand de Got, who took the name Clement V, citing the violent factionalism and political chaos that made Rome unsafe. Clement never journeyed to the city. Instead, in 1309, he moved the entire papal curia, the administrative body of the Holy See, to Avignon. While Avignon was technically part of a papal fief in Provence, it was geographically and politically dominated by the Kingdom of France. This relocation began a period of nearly 70 years, often termed the Babylonian captivity of the Church, during which the papacy was perceived by the rest of Europe as a captive instrument of the French crown. This perception was grounded in political reality. Clement V and his 6 successors were all French, as was the vast majority of the cardinals they appointed. The College of Cardinals, which elected the Pope, transformed into a French-dominated body, ensuring that papal policy would align with the strategic interests of the Valois monarchy. During the opening phases of the Hundred Years' War, for example, the Avignon popes consistently favoured the French cause, providing diplomatic support and financial instruments that benefited the French war effort. For rulers in England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Italy, the Pope was no longer a universal spiritual arbiter but a partisan player, the French king's chaplain, whose pronouncements were tainted by political allegiance. Paradoxically, while its spiritual independence was compromised, the Avignon papacy evolved into the most sophisticated and efficient administrative and financial machine in Europe. Freed from the street-level political turmoil of Rome, the popes built a massive bureaucratic state within the fortified walls of the Palais des Papes. They centralized church governance to an unprecedented degree, creating a complex system of chancelleries, tribunals, and, most importantly, a highly effective treasury known as the Apostolic Camera. This body perfected the art of papal taxation across Christendom, systematizing the collection of annates, a new bishop's first year of revenue, expanding the use of indulgences for cash payments, and imposing a host of fees for ecclesiastical appointments and dispensations. The Avignon papacy became a financial powerhouse, its court known for luxury and nepotism, which only fueled criticism from figures like Petrarch, who lamented its worldliness. This period of French domination, while administratively successful, catastrophically eroded the papacy's universal prestige, transforming it in the eyes of many from a spiritual guide into a temporal power indistinguishable from the secular monarchies it was meant to transcend. For over 3 centuries, the direct line of the House of Capet had produced a male heir for every generation, a remarkable streak of biological good fortune that provided the kingdom with unparalleled stability. This Capetian miracle came to an abrupt end in 1328 with the death of Charles IV. He was the third and last of Philip the Fair's sons to rule, and like his 2 brothers before him, he died without leaving a surviving son. For the first time since 987, there was no obvious successor to the throne of France, creating a constitutional crisis that would plunge the kingdom into more than a century of conflict. 2 principal candidates emerged with compelling claims. The first was Edward III, King of England, whose claim was genealogically the strongest. His mother was Isabella, the daughter of Philip the Fair, making Edward the direct grandson of the formidable French king. By the feudal laws of inheritance common throughout most of Europe, Edward's claim through his mother was superior. The second candidate was Philip of Valois, the son of Philip IV's younger brother, Charles of Valois. Philip's claim was through an unbroken male line, but he was only a nephew and a cousin to the last three kings, a step removed from the direct line of succession. The assembly of French barons and prelates convened to decide the matter was faced with a stark political choice: accept an English king as their sovereign, or find a legal justification to select a French candidate. Their decision was driven by political expediency. To exclude Edward III, they revived an obscure provision from the ancient legal code of the Salian Franks, known as Salic law. This code, written centuries earlier, contained a clause stating that women could not inherit Salic land. This rule, originally pertaining to private property inheritance, was now creatively reinterpreted by French jurists to apply to the throne itself. They argued that the crown could neither be held by a woman nor be transmitted through a female line. This invocation of Salic law was a piece of legal improvisation, a post hoc justification for the politically necessary decision to keep the English king off the French throne. Armed with this convenient legal doctrine, the assembly declared Philip of Valois to be the rightful heir. He was crowned King Philip VI in 1328, inaugurating the House of Valois. While Edward III initially appeared to accept the verdict, paying homage to Philip for his French duchy of Gascony, the issue was far from settled. The English king never truly relinquished his claim, and this dynastic dispute, layered on top of existing conflicts over sovereignty in Gascony and economic control of Flanders, became the primary cause of the Hundred Years' War. The decision of 1328 did not secure French stability. Instead, it lit the fuse for a devastating century-long struggle for the crown itself. The accession of the House of Valois provided the immediate justification for war, but the conflict that erupted in 1337 was the product of deeper, overlapping tensions that had festered for generations. The dynastic question was merely the spark that ignited a complex web of feudal, territorial, and economic disputes. The core structural problem was the status of the Duchy of Gascony, the last remnant of the Angevin Empire. For this substantial territory in southwestern France, the English king, Edward III, was required to perform liege homage to the French king, Philip VI, placing him in the constitutionally untenable position of being a sovereign in England, but a subordinate vassal in France. French monarchs had long pursued a consistent policy of centralizing power and absorbing the great feudal principalities into the royal domain. Philip VI continued this pressure, using his legal authority as suzerain to interfere in the administration of Gascony, encouraging appeals from Edward's vassals to his own royal court, the Parlement of Paris. This persistent legal harassment was correctly seen by the English as an attempt to erode their authority and ultimately confiscate the duchy. A second major point of friction lay in the wealthy county of Flanders. While the Count of Flanders was a vassal of the French crown, the county's prosperous cities had an economic lifeblood tied directly to England. Their massive cloth industry was almost entirely dependent on a steady supply of English wool. When Philip VI pressured the Count to take a more aggressive anti-English stance, Edward III retaliated with a wool embargo in 1336, crippling the Flemish economy and inciting the urban guilds, led by Jacob van Artevelde of Ghent, to revolt against their pro-French Count and align themselves with England. Flanders thus became a critical economic and military battleground, a proxy war for the larger Anglo-French rivalry. Further complicating relations was the Old Alliance between France and Scotland, which the English viewed as a direct threat to their northern border. French support for Scottish independence provided a second front that could be activated to divert English resources. These simmering conflicts came to a head in 1337 when Philip VI, using Edward's support for a French fugitive as a pretext, declared the Duchy of Gascony forfeit and seized it for the crown. This was the final provocation. In response, Edward III moved beyond the feudal dispute and revived his dormant genealogical claim to the French throne. In 1340, he formally assumed the title King of France and quartered his royal arms with the French fleur-de-lis, transforming a conflict over feudal rights into a total war for the succession of the entire kingdom. The 100 Years' War had begun. The English campaign of 1346 was not initially one of conquest, but a large-scale raid, a chevauchée, designed to inflict maximum economic and psychological damage. After landing in Normandy, Edward III's army plundered its way across northern France, forcing Philip VI to assemble a massive host to intercept and annihilate the invaders. Outmaneuvered, and with his line of retreat cut, Edward was forced to make a stand. On August 26, 1346, he chose his ground carefully on a gentle, rain-soaked slope near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. His army was vastly outnumbered, perhaps 12,000 English against a French force of at least 30,000, but he held the tactical advantage. Edward dismounted his knights and men-at-arms, positioning them in 3 divisions, flanked by large wedges of Welsh and English archers, armed with the yew longbow. The French army arrived on the battlefield late in the afternoon, disorganized and dangerously overconfident. The French nobility, embodying the chivalric ideal, believed in the supremacy of the heavy cavalry charge, and were contemptuous of the English commoner archers. Ignoring Philip's orders to make camp and organize for an attack the next day, the knights demanded an immediate assault. The battle commenced with an archery duel. The French sent forward their contingent of hired Genoese crossbowmen, who were exhausted from a long march. Their weapons were slow to load, managing perhaps 2 bolts a minute, and their effectiveness was further hampered when a brief, intense rainstorm slackened their bowstrings. In contrast, the English longbowmen could protect their strings from the rain and unleash a rate of fire of 5 to 10 arrows per minute. The resulting arrow storm was devastating. The Genoese were routed, and as they fled, the first wave of French knights charged through them, trampling their own mercenaries in their haste. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. Over the next several hours, the French nobility launched as many as 16 separate, uncoordinated cavalry charges up the muddy slope, directly into a hail of hundreds of thousands of English arrows. The longbow's bodkin point arrows, while not always able to pierce the thickest plate armor, were lethal to the knights' horses. The charges collapsed into a chaotic pile of screaming, wounded animals and fallen, immobilized men at the base of the English position. English men-at-arms would then advance on foot into the tangle, dispatching the helpless French knights with daggers and hammers. By nightfall, the flower of French chivalry lay dead on the field, including the King of Bohemia and the Duke of Lorraine. Crécy was a catastrophic military and social disaster for France, demonstrating with brutal clarity that the age of the unsupported heavy cavalry charge was over, and that the tactical dominance of the disciplined longbowmen had begun. While the war with England brought intermittent destruction, a far more indiscriminate and terrifying catastrophe arrived in France in 1348. Carried by Genoese trading ships from the Black Sea port of Caffa, the Great Pestilence, or Black Death, was an ecological and demographic event of unprecedented scale. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and transmitted by fleas on black rats that infested the ship's holds, disembarked at Marseille and began its inexorable march northwards. It spread with terrifying speed, moving along the dense networks of trade routes, rivers, and pilgrim paths that crisscrossed the kingdom. Within 2 years, no corner of France remained untouched. The plague manifested in 3 distinct and horrific forms. The most common was the bubonic form, characterized by the swelling of lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck into painful buboes, followed by fever and delirium, with a mortality rate of around 60%. More lethal was the pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs and was spread directly from person to person, through coughing, killing nearly all its victims within days. The rarest and most deadly was the septicemic form, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing rapid death, often before any visible symptoms could even develop. Medical knowledge of the era was utterly powerless against such an onslaught. Treatments based on humoral theory, such as bloodletting, were ineffective, while public health measures like quarantine were implemented too sporadically to halt the pandemic's spread. The demographic collapse was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that France lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its entire population in the initial outbreak between 1348 and 1350. Entire villages were wiped out, and cities like Paris saw their populations decimated. This massive loss of life shattered the social fabric. Fear overwhelmed traditional bonds of family and community, with the sick being abandoned by their relatives. In the face of inexplicable mass death, societies sought scapegoats, leading to horrific pogroms against Jewish communities who were baselessly accused of poisoning wells. The Church's inability to offer either explanation or relief profoundly shook popular faith, giving rise to radical penitential movements like the Flagellants, who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in a desperate attempt to atone for the sins they believed had brought God's wrath upon them. The economic consequences were equally profound. The immense death toll created a critical labor shortage, which fundamentally altered the balance of power between lords and peasants. Surviving laborers were suddenly a scarce and valuable resource, able to demand higher wages and greater freedoms. This newfound leverage for the peasantry accelerated the collapse of the traditional manorial system and the institution of serfdom. The Black Death, more than any war or royal decree, was the great transformative event of the 14th century, reshaping the economic, social, and psychological landscape of the kingdom for generations to come. The decade following the Black Death saw no respite from the war. In 1356, 10 years after Crécy, the English launched another devastating chevauchée, this time from their Gascon territories. Led by Edward III's son, Edward, the Black Prince, a small but veteran Anglo-Gascon army of around 6,000 men swept north, plundering its way through the rich heartlands of the kingdom, deliberately provoking the French into a decisive battle. The new French king, John II, took the bait, assembling a professional army of over 15,000 and successfully cornering the Black Prince's force near Poitiers, cutting off its retreat to Gascony. John, determined to avoid the mistakes of Crécy, chose a different tactical approach. Seeing the strength of the English defensive position, set amidst hedges and marshy ground, he ordered the vast majority of his knights and men-at-arms to dismount and advance on foot, believing this would negate the lethal effects of the English longbows on their horses. On September 19, 1356, the battle began. The French advanced in a series of 4 massive dismounted divisions. The first assaults were repulsed by the relentless volleys of English archers, whose arrows found their marks in the less protected joints of the French armour. The difficult terrain channeled the French attack, breaking their cohesion and turning the advance into a grueling, exhausting slog. Despite immense casualties, the sheer weight of French numbers began to tell, and the Anglo-Gascon line was on the verge of breaking. At this critical moment, the Black Prince executed a brilliant tactical maneuver. While the main French force was heavily engaged, he dispatched a small mobile reserve of mounted knights under a local Gascon lord, the Captal de Buch, on a wide flanking march. This cavalry force slammed into the rear of the French 4th Division, which was commanded by the king himself. Attacked simultaneously from the front and the rear, the French formation disintegrated. Panic swept through the ranks, leading to a total collapse of the army. In the ensuing rout, thousands were killed or captured. King John II, fighting valiantly on foot alongside his youngest son Philip, was surrounded. Refusing to flee, he was taken prisoner, an event of catastrophic significance. The capture of an anointed king on the battlefield was a constitutional and psychological disaster without precedent. The defeat at Poitiers plunged France into anarchy. With the king in captivity in London, a power vacuum emerged, leading to the peasant revolt known as the Jacquerie and the collapse of royal authority. The subsequent Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 was ruinous. It set an astronomical ransom of 3 million gold écus for John's release, and ceded a vast, fully sovereign Duchy of Aquitaine to England. The kingdom was paralysed, its military reputation shattered, and its government bankrupt, marking the absolute nadir of French fortunes in the war. The power vacuum created by King John II's capture at Poitiers did not simply paralyse the government, it shattered the social contract that underpinned the feudal order. With the king imprisoned and the Dauphin Charles struggling to govern, the French nobility's prestige had evaporated. Their catastrophic failures at Crécy and Poitiers had exposed their military incompetence, betraying their fundamental duty to protect the realm. To the peasantry, the knights were no longer noble protectors, but a parasitic class that had failed in its most basic function, yet continued to demand privileges and taxes. The burden of funding the war and the king's ransom fell squarely on the Third Estate, primarily through new crushing levies like the taille. Compounding this misery was the scourge of the routiers' demobilized mercenary companies, both French and English, who roamed the countryside, pillaging, raping, and murdering with impunity, while the local lords proved incapable of stopping them. The final insult came when the nobles demanded unpaid peasant labour, the corvée, to repair the very castles from which they had failed to provide protection. In late May 1358, this accumulation of misery, humiliation, and rage finally exploded. The uprising began spontaneously in the Beauvais region, north of Paris, and spread with the speed of a wildfire across Picardy, Champagne, and the Île-de-France. The nobility contemptuously called it the Jacquerie, after their generic slur for a peasant, Jacques Bonhomme. This was not a structured revolt with political goals, but a primal scream of vengeance. Led by a charismatic and militarily experienced peasant named Guillaume Caille, bands of rebels attacked hundreds of castles. Their violence was terrifyingly personal and symbolic. They were not just killing lords, they were systematically eradicating the symbols of their oppression, murdering noble families, and burning the charters and legal documents that recorded their feudal obligations. The chronicler Jean Froissart, though biased toward the aristocracy, recorded acts of unspeakable brutality, reflecting the profound depth of class hatred that had been unleashed. The suppression was even more savage than the uprising. The French nobility, temporarily setting aside their internal squabbles, united in terror and class solidarity. Charles II of Navarre, a rival claimant to the throne, took a leading role, viewing the rebellion as an opportunity to assert his power. At the Battle of Mello in June, the disorganized peasant army was annihilated. Guillaume Caille was lured into a supposed parley, captured and tortured to death, crowned with a red-hot iron trivet in a grotesque parody of kingship. In the weeks that followed, the nobles conducted a calculated campaign of terror across the countryside, indiscriminately slaughtering an estimated 20 peasants in punitive massacres that dwarfed the violence of the initial revolt. The Jacquerie was drowned in blood, but it had laid bare the deep, violent fractures within French society, serving as a brutal testament to the desperation of a populace pushed beyond all limits of endurance. The reign of Charles V, beginning in 1364, marked a profound shift in French strategy, moving from the disastrous chivalric impulses of his predecessors to a calculated, intellectual approach to statecraft and war. Having witnessed the chaos of the Jacquerie and the collapse of royal authority, as Dauphin, Charles, known as the Wise, was a physically frail scholar, not a field commander. He understood that the kingdom could not survive another Crécy or Poitiers, and that France's recovery depended not on battlefield glory, but on systematic reform. His primary objective was the methodical dismantling of the territorial settlement imposed by the Treaty of Bretigny. To achieve this, he first needed to stabilize the kingdom's finances and professionalize its military. Charles's most significant administrative achievement was the establishment of the first permanent royal taxation in French history. He successfully persuaded the Estates General to approve ongoing levies, such as the feuillage, a direct hearth tax, and the gabelle, a tax on salt. This provided the crown with a stable, predictable income stream, independent of the ad hoc and often unreliable feudal grants of the past. This fiscal revolution was the bedrock of his military reforms. With a secure treasury, Charles could afford to create a professional standing army. He issued ordinances that organized soldiers into permanent, paid companies under the command of crown-appointed captains. This policy had a dual benefit. It created a disciplined fighting force, loyal to the king, and provided a solution to the scourge of the routiers by hiring the mercenary captains and their men directly into royal service. Militarily, Charles V implemented a Fabian strategy of attrition, explicitly forbidding his commanders from engaging the English in large-scale pitched battles. His chosen constable, the brilliant Breton commander Bertrand du Guesclin, perfected this new form of warfare. Instead of seeking glorious charges, du Guesclin's forces conducted a relentless campaign of skirmishes, ambushes, and sieges. They targeted isolated English garrisons, disrupted supply lines, and patiently retook castles and towns one by one. This war of the flea exhausted the English, who were overstretched and struggled to defend their vast continental holdings. The French leveraged their superior knowledge of the terrain and the support of the local populace, who increasingly saw the Capetian monarchy as the legitimate defender of the realm. By the time of Charles V's death in 1380, this methodical and inglorious strategy had yielded spectacular results. Nearly all the territories ceded at Bretigny, including most of Aquitaine, had been recovered. The English were reduced to holding only Calais and a few coastal strongholds. Charles the Wise, without ever leading an army himself, had used statecraft and strategy to bring the kingdom back from the brink of dissolution. The successful reign of Charles V was bookended by a crisis that would tear the spiritual heart of Europe apart, a conflict in which the French crown was a principal architect. The crisis began in 1377, when Pope Gregory XI, yielding to immense pressure, moved the papacy back to Rome, ending the nearly 70-year Avignon residency. His death, just a year later, triggered the catastrophe. The Roman populace, fearing the election of another Frenchman who might return the court to Avignon, surrounded the Vatican, demanding a Roman or at least an Italian pope. Under this direct and violent intimidation, the conclave of cardinals, the majority of whom were French, hastily elected the Italian Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI. Almost immediately, it became clear that the election had been a disastrous mistake. Urban VI proved to be an aggressively autocratic and mentally unstable reformer, who publicly berated, threatened, and humiliated the cardinals who had elected him, vowing to strip them of their wealth and influence. Fearing for their safety and their positions, the French cardinals fled Rome just a few months later. They regrouped at Anagni and issued a manifesto declaring Urban VI's election null and void, arguing it had been conducted under duress and was therefore canonically invalid. Free from Roman pressure, they proceeded to elect one of their own, Robert of Geneva, a powerful cardinal with close ties to the French royal family. He became Pope Clement VII. Unable to oust Urban from Rome, Clement eventually re-established a papal court in Avignon in 1379. The Great Schism of the West had begun. The French monarchy was the critical political actor that allowed the schism to take root. Charles V, seeing an opportunity to restore French dominance over the papacy, formally recognized Clement VII, providing him with the political, financial, and military backing necessary to maintain a rival pontificate. This French support immediately internationalized the crisis, splitting Christendom along clear geopolitical fault lines. Europe was forced to choose sides. France and its allies Scotland, Castile, Aragon, and the Kingdom of Naples supported the Avignonese papacy. England, locked in the 100 Years' War with France, naturally took the opposing side, alongside the Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, Poland, and the city-states of northern Italy, who all recognized the Roman Pope. The schism was no longer a purely ecclesiastical dispute. It had become a spiritual extension of Europe's secular conflicts. For nearly 40 years, two, and eventually three rival popes excommunicated each other and their followers, creating profound spiritual anxiety and institutional chaos. The scandal shattered the universal authority of the papacy and gave rise to the conciliar movement, a radical theory championed by theologians at the University of Paris, which argued that the ultimate authority in the Church resided not with a pope, but with a general council. The fragile recovery engineered by Charles V shattered under his successor, Charles VI, whose reign began with a long minority dominated by his powerful and rapacious uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, and Burgundy. The stability of the kingdom rested precariously on the person of the monarch, and in the summer of 1392, that foundation crumbled. While leading a military expedition, the king suffered a sudden and violent psychotic episode in the forest of Le Mans, attacking his own knights in a paranoid rage. This was the first manifestation of a recurring mental illness that would plague him for the rest of his life. Featuring long periods of lucidity, punctuated by terrifying bouts of insanity, including the delusion that he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. The king's incapacity created a devastating power vacuum at the center of the French state. When the king was mad, the government ceased to function, leaving the realm rudderless. This void was ruthlessly exploited by two competing figures in the royal family. The first was the king's ambitious younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans. The second was his powerful uncle and former regent, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who controlled the vast and wealthy territories of Burgundy and Flanders. Their intense political rivalry for control of the regency, the royal treasury, and influence over the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, defined French politics for 2 decades. The rivalry turned murderous after Philip's death, when his son John the Fearless inherited the Burgundian dukedom. On November 23, 1407, John the Fearless had Louis of Orléans brutally assassinated in the streets of Paris. This single act of political violence plunged the simmering court rivalry into a full-blown civil war. The kingdom fractured into 2 warring factions. The Orléanist party, which came to be known as the Armagnacs after their new leader, Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, represented the interests of the high nobility and the central Valois monarchy. The Burgundian party, controlling Paris and allied with its powerful guilds, postured as reformers and champions of the common people against oppressive taxation, even while pursuing their own territorial ambitions. For the next 3 decades, France was torn apart by a brutal internal conflict characterized by assassinations, massacres, and shifting alliances. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War completely paralyzed the French state, creating a political and military catastrophe. It was this internal collapse that provided the perfect opportunity for a new English king, Henry V, to reignite the 100 Years' War and pursue his own claim to the French throne. The internal collapse of France offered the ambitious English king, Henry V, an unparalleled opportunity. Landing in Normandy in 1415, his initial campaign was nearly crippled by a grueling siege at Harfleur that decimated his army through combat and dysentery. With a force reduced to perhaps 6,000 men, the majority being longbowmen, Henry began a perilous march toward the safety of English-held Calais. The French, momentarily setting aside their internal feuds, mobilized a colossal army under the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, to intercept and annihilate the weakened English force. They blocked Henry's path near the village of Agincourt, deploying a force that outnumbered the English by at least 4 to 1. The French host was a roll call of the high nobility, a massive concentration of heavily armoured knights and men-at-arms, all supremely confident of a swift and glorious victory. The critical factor on October 25, 1415, was the terrain. The battle was fought on a narrow strip of recently ploughed farmland, hemmed in on both sides by dense woods. Days of heavy rain had turned the field into a deep, sucking quagmire. This geography nullified France's numerical superiority, forcing their vast army to funnel into a constricted space. Henry V's tactical genius was in recognizing and exploiting this advantage. He arrayed his small force of dismounted men-at-arms in a thin line, with large wedges of longbowmen on the flanks. Critically, he had the archers plant sharpened wooden stakes in the ground before them, creating a deadly defensive barrier against any cavalry charge. The French plan was simple: a massive frontal assault by dismounted men, at arms in 3 successive waves, or battles. As the first wave advanced, they were channeled into the muddy bottleneck. Weighed down by 50 to 60 pounds of plate armor, they sank into the mud with every step, becoming exhausted before they even made contact with the English line. It was into this packed, slow-moving mass of humanity that the English longbowmen unleashed a storm of arrows at a rate of 10 to 12 per minute per man. The sheer volume of fire was devastating, inflicting horrific casualties and creating chaos. When the exhausted French vanguard finally reached the English line, they were too tightly packed to effectively use their weapons and were met by the more lightly armoured and less fatigued English men-at-arms. The archers, having expended their arrows, abandoned their bows and joined the brutal melee with axes, mallets, and swords, slaughtering the floundering French knights. The result was a catastrophe for France on an unimaginable scale. The French nobility was shattered, with thousands killed, including the constable, 3 dukes, and scores of other high-ranking aristocrats. Agincourt was not just a military defeat. It was the decapitation of France's ruling class. The crushing defeat at Agincourt did not end the French Civil War. It intensified the kingdom's paralysis, allowing Henry V to spend the subsequent years in a methodical conquest of Normandy. While the English consolidated their hold, the Armagnac and Burgundian factions continued their destructive conflict. The critical turning point came in 1419 during a supposed peace negotiation on the bridge at Montereau. In a catastrophic act of treachery, followers of the Dauphin Charles murdered John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, in full view of both parties. This assassination was an unforgivable crime that extinguished any hope of a united French resistance. It drove the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, to seek vengeance by forging a formal, binding alliance with England. With the most powerful duchy in France now actively collaborating with the invaders, Henry V held an unassailable position. The Burgundians controlled Paris, the royal administration, and the person of the insane King Charles VI. Siding with them was Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, who, for complex political and personal reasons, was willing to disown her own son, the Dauphin. This coalition of English power and Burgundian vengeance produced the Treaty of Troyes, signed on May 21, 1420. The terms of this treaty were a complete and radical reordering of the French monarchy. It stipulated that Henry V would marry Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI. Upon the marriage, Henry would be recognized as the regent of France and the legal heir to the throne. The Dauphin Charles was officially declared illegitimate, legally disinherited, and stripped of all rights to the succession. The treaty created a legal framework for a dual monarchy, a personal union that would unite the crowns of England and France under a single king, Henry V, and his future heirs. This was not a conquest in legal terms, but a dynastic transfer of power, legitimized by the reigning French monarch, even if he was mentally incompetent. It effectively handed the Kingdom of France to the English king. The immediate result was the division of the realm into 2 distinct entities. In the north, the Anglo-Burgundian alliance controlled Paris, Normandy, and vast territories loyal to the new order. In the south, the disinherited Dauphin established a rump state, derisively called the Kingdom of Bourges, from which he maintained his claim as the rightful heir. The Treaty of Troyes represented the absolute nadir of French fortunes in the 100 Years' War. By 1428, the military situation for the disinherited Dauphin Charles had become critical. The Anglo-Burgundian alliance controlled the north, and the English regent, the Duke of Bedford, initiated a campaign to conquer the remaining Valois territories south of the Loire River. The strategic key to this entire region was the fortified city of Orléans. It was the last major loyalist stronghold on the Loire, a vital crossing point, and the gateway to the Dauphin's capital at Bourges. Its capture would not only sever Valois France in two, but would likely shatter the remaining morale and lead to the final collapse of the Armagnac cause. The English, under the command of the experienced Earl of Salisbury, began their investment of the city in October 1428. Their strategy was not a full, immediate assault, but a methodical war of attrition. Recognizing they lacked the manpower to completely encircle the large city, the English constructed a series of earthen and wooden forts, known as bastilles, at key points around the perimeter. This network of fortifications was designed to interdict supply lines and slowly strangle Orléans into submission. The most crucial of these positions was the Tourelles, a stone gatehouse that commanded the city's main bridge across the Loire. Shortly after the siege began, Salisbury was mortally wounded by a cannonball while observing the city from the Tourelles, but his death did not halt the English advance. Command passed to the Earl of Suffolk and later the formidable Lord Talbot, and the methodical construction of the siege works continued throughout the winter. Inside Orléans, the defenders, led by Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, mounted a determined resistance, but the military situation grew progressively grimmer. The French army had been so thoroughly demoralized by decades of catastrophic defeats that it seemed incapable of effective action. This was starkly demonstrated in February 1429 during the Battle of the Herrings, when a French force attempting to intercept an English supply convoy was routed in open battle. The defeat confirmed the sense of English invincibility and plunged the Dauphin's court at Chinon into a state of profound despair. Political advisers began openly discussing the possibility of the Dauphin fleeing to Scotland or the Dauphiné. Militarily, the English siege was a textbook success, and politically, the Valois cause was on the verge of disintegration. By the spring of 1429, the fall of Orléans was no longer considered a possibility, but a foregone conclusion. Into the atmosphere of military and political despair at Chinon arrived a phenomenon for which the rational calculations of warfare had no answer. Joan of Arc, an illiterate teenage peasant from the village of Domremy in the borderlands of Lorraine, presented herself at the court of the Dauphin Charles in early 1429. For several years, she had experienced auditory and visual hallucinations, which she identified as the voices and forms of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch. These voices communicated a twofold mission. She was to raise the English siege of Orléans and lead the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. After convincing the local commander at Vaucouleurs, Robert de Baudricourt, of her sincerity, she was granted an escort and made a perilous 11-day journey through hostile Burgundian territory to reach the Dauphin. Her arrival was met with profound skepticism. To verify the authenticity of her claims and ensure she was not a heretic or sorceress, Charles sent her to Poitiers for an exhaustive examination by a panel of high-ranking ecclesiastics. For weeks these theologians questioned her on her faith, her visions, and her intentions. Their final verdict was cautiously positive. They found nothing heretical in her, and recommended that, given the kingdom's desperate situation, her claims should be put to the test. This ecclesiastical approval provided the Dauphin with the political and religious cover he needed. In a decision born of desperation, he agreed to her request. Joan was equipped with a suit of white armour, a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, and granted nominal command of a relief army destined for Orléans. Her effect on the French military was immediate and transformative. The army, beaten down by decades of defeat and crippled by a deep-seated inferiority complex, was suddenly infused with a renewed sense of purpose and divine favour. Her piety, conviction, and unwavering confidence were infectious, replacing cynicism and despair with religious fervour. She imposed a new moral code on the notoriously ill-disciplined soldiers, expelling prostitutes from the camps and demanding the men attend mass and confession. This was not merely a spiritual cleansing, it was a psychological rearmament. The soldiers began to believe they were part of a holy war, an army of God led by a divinely sent messenger. For the first time in a generation, the French forces advanced not with the expectation of defeat, but with the conviction of inevitable victory. The demoralized rabble that had been routed at the Battle of the Herrings was galvanized into a potent and motivated fighting force before Joan had even reached the besieged city. Following the miraculous relief of Orléans, the strategic initiative shifted decisively. Joan of Arc insisted that the momentum be used not to reclaim lost territory, but to secure the Dauphin's legitimacy through consecration. This required clearing the remaining English strongholds in the Loire Valley. In a lightning campaign in June 1429, the revitalized French army, accompanied by Joan, captured Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency in rapid succession. The campaign culminated on June 18th at the Battle of Patay, a stunning reversal of previous French fortunes. Here, the French heavy cavalry, employed aggressively, managed to catch and annihilate an English army, primarily composed of longbowmen, before they could deploy their defensive stakes. Patay shattered the myth of English invincibility in open battle and opened a clear, if still dangerous, path to Reims. The subsequent march to Reims was a profound political and psychological gamble, taking the Dauphin and his army deep into territory controlled by the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. Yet, the supernatural prestige now attached to Joan's mission proved more potent than military force. Cities that lay in their path, including the strategically important Troyes, capitulated without a fight, their inhabitants convinced they were witnessing a divine mandate. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII in Reims Cathedral, the traditional site for the consecration of French monarchs. With Joan at his side, he underwent the sacred rites of anointing, a ceremony that conferred upon him an undeniable divine legitimacy that no political treaty could erase. In the eyes of the French populace, he was no longer the disinherited Dauphin of Bourges, but the one true, God-sanctioned King of France. After the coronation, the sense of divine urgency that had propelled the French army began to wane, replaced by the cautious indecision of the royal court. A subsequent half-hearted assault on Paris in September failed, and Joan was wounded. The following spring, in May 1430, while defending the town of Compiègne, she was unhorsed and captured by Burgundian soldiers. Charles VII, for reasons of political calculation and financial constraint, made no attempt to ransom her. Seeing a priceless opportunity to discredit the king they had just crowned, the Burgundians sold their captive to the English. The English orchestrated a meticulously staged ecclesiastical trial in their Norman capital of Rouen. The objective was political, to prove Joan a heretic and a witch, thereby invalidating her mission and, by extension, the legitimacy of Charles VII's crown. Presided over by the pro-English Bishop of Beauvais, Pierre Cauchon, the trial began in February 1431. For months, Joan, held in a secular prison, was subjected to intense interrogation by a tribunal of theologians. On May 30, 1431, after being found guilty of relapsed heresy, primarily on the charge of resuming male clothing, the 19-year-old was burned at the stake in the Old Market Square of Rouen. Joan of Arc's death did not produce an immediate French victory. Instead, it marked the beginning of a slow structural transformation of the French war effort. The most significant turning point was diplomatic, not military. In 1435, at the Congress of Arras, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, formally abandoned his English alliance and reconciled with Charles VII. This act ended the devastating French Civil War that had enabled the English occupation. The loss of Burgundian support was a catastrophic strategic blow for England, depriving them of their most powerful continental ally and isolating their forces in northern France. Secure on his throne and no longer facing a rival French faction, Charles VII began the systematic process of state-building and military modernization. The centerpiece of his reforms was the establishment of the Compagnie d'Ordonnance in the 1440s. This was a radical innovation, the creation of a permanent, professional standing army paid and supplied directly by the crown. Feudal levies were replaced by disciplined units of heavy cavalry, known as gendarmes, and free archer infantry. This professionalization ended the monarchy's reliance on unreliable and self-interested nobles. Concurrently, the French crown made an immense investment in artillery technology under the direction of the Bureau brothers, Jean and Gaspard. They developed standardized mobile siege cannons and culverins that were the most effective in Europe, transforming the nature of siege warfare. Armed with this new military instrument, the French reconquest began in earnest. The strategy deliberately avoided the disastrous pitched battles of the past. Instead, the French army engaged in methodical siege campaigns, using its powerful artillery train to systematically reduce English-held towns and castles. The campaign to retake Normandy in 1449–1450 demonstrated the efficacy of this new approach. The Battle of Formigny in 1450 was a decisive test. An English army was crushed when its longbowmen were outflanked by French cavalry and decimated by artillery. The age of English tactical dominance was over. The final campaign targeted Gascony, an English possession for 3 centuries. An English expeditionary force, led by the veteran commander John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, attempted to relieve the French siege of Castillon in 1453. The French commander, Jean Bureau, had prepared a fortified artillery park. Talbot, disdaining the new technology, ordered a direct frontal assault. The English charge was obliterated by a massed volley of nearly 300 cannons. Talbot and his son were both killed. The Battle of Castillon was the last major engagement of the war. With the subsequent fall of Bordeaux, the 100 Years' War came to an effective end, leaving the English with only the port of Calais. The military victories that secured the French reconquest were the direct result of a preceding, and arguably more profound administrative revolution. The 100 Years' War had painfully exposed the fatal inadequacies of the traditional feudal military system. A French king could summon his vassals, who in turn brought their own retainers, but this system was fundamentally unreliable. Service was often limited to a customary 40 days, training was inconsistent, and the loyalty of the troops was ultimately to their immediate lord, not to the crown. This structure produced armies that were temporary, undisciplined, and plagued by the competing ambitions of the high nobility. Charles VII, having witnessed this systemic failure firsthand, recognized that military success and the consolidation of the state required a new model. The solution, codified in the Grand Ordonnance of 1445, was the creation of the Compagnie d'Ordonnance. This was not merely a reform, it was the birth of the first modern standing army in Europe since the Roman Empire. The ordinance established 15 companies, each comprising 100 lances. A lance was a standardized small tactical unit, consisting of a fully armored man-at-arms, gendarme, a custellier, 2 pages, and 2 mounted archers. These were not feudal levies, but professional, full-time soldiers, enlisted directly by the crown and subject to a strict code of military discipline. Captains were appointed by the king, and the companies were garrisoned in strategic towns across the kingdom, serving as both a defense against external threats and a powerful instrument of internal order. Their existence was made possible by a fiscal revolution, the establishment of the taille, a direct tax, as a permanent royal revenue stream, freeing the monarchy from its dependence on negotiating funds from the Estates General for every campaign. To complement this professional heavy cavalry, a second reform in 1448 created the Franks archers, or free archers. This edict mandated that every parish in the kingdom equip and supply 1 skilled archer who would be exempt from the taille in exchange for regular training and readiness for royal service. While this attempt to create a national infantry militia proved less effective and more difficult to manage than the professional companies, it represented a significant step toward universal military obligation under royal authority. The immediate effect of these reforms was the suppression of the lawless mercenary bands, the écorcheurs, who had ravaged the countryside for decades. Many were forcibly integrated into the new army, while the rest were hunted down and destroyed. For the first time, the French monarchy possessed a monopoly on legitimate force within its own realm, a crucial prerequisite for the emergence of the centralized early modern state. The consolidation of military and fiscal authority under Charles VII was paralleled by an equally decisive assertion of royal power over the ecclesiastical sphere. The Great Schism had profoundly damaged papal prestige, giving rise to the conciliar movement, which argued for the supremacy of a general church council over the Pope. This provided the ideological foundation for a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between the French monarchy and the papacy. In 1438, Charles VII convened an assembly of French clergy at Bourges and, with their assent, issued the Pragmatic Sanction. This edict was a radical declaration of ecclesiastical independence, effectively nationalizing the Catholic Church in France under royal authority. The sanctions articles directly challenged centuries of papal prerogative. It formally adopted the decrees of the Council of Basel, affirming that a general council held its authority directly from Christ, and that all, including the Pope, were bound to obey it. More practically, it systematically dismantled the financial and administrative mechanisms of papal control. The edict abolished annates, the substantial payments a new bishop or abbot was required to send to Rome upon his appointment, thus redirecting a massive stream of revenue from the papacy to the French crown and its clerical appointees. Furthermore, it stripped the Pope of his right to make appointments to ecclesiastical benefices in France. The sanction decreed that bishops were to be elected by the canons of their cathedral chapters, and abbots by the monks of their monasteries. While framed as a restoration of ancient liberties to the French Church, the Pragmatic Sanction was, in reality, a transfer of power to the king. The monarchy now possessed immense influence over the supposedly free elections of the clergy, ensuring that the highest and wealthiest positions in the French Church would be filled by men loyal to the crown. This gave the king control not only over the vast lands and wealth of the Church, but also over a highly educated administrative class. The edict also sharply limited the right of appeal from French ecclesiastical courts to the Roman Curia, establishing the Parlement of Paris as the supreme judicial authority in most church matters. This act was the cornerstone of the Gallican tradition, a distinct political and theological doctrine asserting the autonomy of the French Church from papal interference. For the next several decades, the papacy would fight relentlessly to have the sanction repealed, but the principle of royal supremacy over the Church in France had been firmly established. The reign of Louis XI, beginning in 1461, marked a definitive break from the traditions of medieval kingship. Where his predecessors had relied on chivalric valor and open warfare, Louis preferred the shadows, earning the epithet the universal spider for the complex webs of intrigue he spun across Europe. His primary objective was the final destruction of the great feudal houses that still challenged the authority of the crown. His methods were diplomacy, espionage, bribery, and the calculated application of political pressure, tools he wielded with unparalleled cunning. Upon ascending the throne, he immediately faced a formidable challenge in the League of the Public Weal, a coalition of powerful nobles led by his arch-rival, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. This alliance sought to reverse the centralizing gains made by Charles VII and restore the autonomy of the great fiefdoms. Louis approached this threat not with a decisive battle, but with a strategy of division and subversion. He negotiated the Treaty of Conflans, making significant territorial concessions to appease the dukes, while simultaneously working behind the scenes to undermine their unity. He established a vast network of spies and agents, paid for with the steady revenues from the tail, who reported on the internal politics of his rivals' courts. Louis excelled at fomenting discord, secretly funding rebellions in Burgundian-controlled cities like Liège and Ghent to distract and drain the resources of Charles the Bold. He understood that money was a more effective weapon than the sword. He bribed English councillors to prevent invasions and paid pensions to Swiss cantons to secure their military alliance against Burgundy. Louis's statecraft was supported by pragmatic economic policies designed to enrich the crown. He encouraged the growth of trade fairs, established a royal postal service to speed communication, and promoted new industries, most notably the silk looms of Lyon. The wealth generated by these initiatives funded his political machinations. His ultimate triumph was the destruction of the Duchy of Burgundy. Rather than confronting Charles the Bold directly, Louis orchestrated a coalition of Burgundy's enemies. He provided crucial financial subsidies to the Swiss Confederacy, whose disciplined pike infantry proved devastatingly effective against Burgundian heavy cavalry. Charles the Bold was defeated and killed at the Battle of Nancy in 1477 by a Swiss and Lorraine army. With his rival dead and without a male heir, Louis XI swiftly moved to absorb the Duchy of Burgundy and Picardy into the royal domain. Through similar methods of inheritance and political maneuvering, he later secured Anjou, Maine, and Provence, effectively shattering the power of the feudal aristocracy and consolidating the Kingdom of France into a centralized, modern state. The contest between Louis XI and Charles the Bold represented the final, and most dramatic, confrontation between the centralizing French monarchy and the immense power of the great feudal appanages. The Burgundian state was no mere duchy. It was a composite political entity of immense wealth and ambition, a middle kingdom stretching from the North Sea coast of Flanders to the borders of Switzerland. Charles the Bold, inheriting this powerful domain in 1467, was the antithesis of his rival Louis. Where the French king was cautious and conspiratorial, Charles was impetuous, militaristic, and driven by a grand vision to transform his collection of duchies and counties into a new, independent kingdom, reviving the ancient Carolingian realm of Lotharingia. This ambition set him on a collision course with Louis XI, whose life's work was the consolidation of France. Charles's strategy was one of direct territorial expansion, seeking to link his northern lands in the Low Countries with his southern possessions in Burgundy proper. This led him into a series of aggressive campaigns to conquer the intervening territories, particularly the Duchy of Lorraine and lands along the Rhine, including Alsace. Louis XI countered not with open battle, but with his preferred weapon, money. He poured vast sums into the coffers of Charles's enemies, most critically the Swiss Confederacy. The Swiss, with their revolutionary pike phalanxes, were the perfect military antidote to Burgundy's traditional heavy cavalry. While Charles was besieging the town of Neuss on the Rhine, a campaign that drained his treasury and exhausted his army, Louis's diplomacy was cementing the anti-Burgundian coalition. The breaking point came in 1476. Enraged by Swiss incursions, Charles invaded the Confederacy, only to suffer two catastrophic and humiliating defeats. At the Battle of Grandson, his army was routed, and the Swiss captured his immense treasury and artillery train. Months later, at the Battle of Murat, his reconstituted army was systematically annihilated. The myth of Burgundian invincibility was shattered, and Charles's resources were crippled. His final desperate act was the siege of Nancy, the capital of Lorraine, in the winter of 1477. It was here that a relief army of Swiss and Lorrainer troops, funded by Louis XI, fell upon his depleted forces. The Burgundian army was destroyed, and Charles the Bold was killed in the fighting. His body found days later, frozen and partially eaten by wolves. With his great rival eliminated, Louis acted immediately, invading and annexing the core Burgundian lands of the duchy itself and Picardy into the royal domain. The great Burgundian state was dismembered, and the last major feudal obstacle to a unified French kingdom was irrevocably broken.